child. Well, I'd say you're under. Oh, I don't think so, mon ami. Don't have any? Say it, pussy. Mark my words, I will exterminate you! What's it from now on?
There's my favorite husband.
Goat milk, chocolate milk, half and half.
What about regular milk?
1, 2, 3, girls.
But I keep forgetting. This guy.
Hey, there he is. A coochie, 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 coochie. Now what will make you happy? Bahamas. All of them. Look. Oh.
See, he loves his daddy. He's sharing.
What if the most beloved animated film about friendship is actually about conquest? What if How to Train Your Dragon isn't the heartwarming story of a boy who learns to love the misunderstood other, but a meticulous blueprint for how empires rebrand domination as liberation and make us cheer while they do it? Everyone knows this story. Hiccup, the misfit Viking who can't kill dragons, befriends one instead. He names him Toothless. They learn to trust each other. Hiccup shows his village that dragons aren't monsters. They're creatures worthy of love and respect. The Vikings stop fighting dragons and start riding them. Prejudice ends. Harmony begins. It's a story about overcoming fear, challenging your parents' bigotry, proving that understanding conquers hate. It won Best Animated Feature. It spawned 2 sequels and a franchise. A generation of children learned that the key to peace is recognizing the humanity or dragonhood of your enemy. Beautiful, right? Wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. How to Train Your Dragon isn't a story about befriending the other. It's a story about domesticating the other, about transforming conquest into care, about how the most insidious form of imperialism isn't the kind that arrives with weapons drawn. It's the kind that arrives with open hands, claiming to liberate while it subjugates. Hiccup doesn't save the dragons, he doesn't free them. He conquers them more completely than his father ever could, because unlike Stoic's violent domination, Hiccup's control makes the dominated grateful for their chains. This film teaches children, teaches us, that domination is love if you do it gently enough, that stripping autonomy is friendship if you smile while you do it, that colonization is heroism if the colonizer cares about the colonized. And we swallow this narrative wholesale because the film wraps it in such gorgeous animation, such soaring music, such genuine emotion that we never stop to ask the question at the heart of everything. What does Toothless want? The answer is, we'll never know, because the film never asks, because asking would shatter the entire fantasy, because the moment you give the colonized a voice, the colonizer's story falls apart. Here's the thesis, and I'll be building the case for it across every scene, every frame, every structural choice this film makes. How to Train Your Dragon is a story about the violence of domestication disguised as liberation, where Hiccup's friendship with Toothless represents not the end of conquest, but its most insidious evolution, the colonization that calls itself love. The film presents imperialism with a progressive face, and we celebrate it because the empire has learned to smile. This isn't about whether DreamWorks intentionally created colonial propaganda. Intent doesn't matter. What matters is what the story does, what it teaches, what ideology it perpetuates. And what How to Train Your Dragon does, with extraordinary effectiveness, is make domination look like friendship, control look like care, and the systematic subjugation of an entire species look like the ultimate happy ending. Let me show you what everyone misses. Let me show you the scenes you've watched a dozen times without seeing what's actually happening. The moment in the cove where Hiccup gains Toothless's trust isn't the beginning of friendship. It's the moment Hiccup realizes he can control a dragon through dependence rather than force. The prosthetic tail isn't a gift, it's a leash disguised as kindness, ensuring Toothless can never fly without his master's permission. The montage of Vikings learning to ride dragons isn't enlightenment. It's the visual representation of an entire species being transformed from autonomous beings into beasts of burden. And that final shot of Burke at peace, Vikings and dragons living in harmony, that's not utopia. That's what successful colonization looks like when the colonized have been so thoroughly dominated they can no longer imagine freedom. The film shows us all of this. It's right there on screen, but it surrounds the domination with such emotional manipulation, such genuine affection between Hiccup and Toothless, such stirring music, such spectacular flight sequences that we're trained to see subjugation as salvation. We watch a boy systematically strip a dragon of autonomy, and we cry at the beauty of their bond. We watch an entire species lose its freedom, and we cheer because the chains are painted to look like friendship bracelets. This matters. This isn't academic nitpicking about a children's film. This is about how we're taught to recognize or fail to recognize power, how we're trained to see benevolent control as acceptable, even admirable. How we learn that loving something justifies controlling it, that understanding something gives you the right to dominate it, that civilizing the wild is an act of compassion rather than violence. How to Train Your Dragon was released in 2010, in the middle of the humanitarian intervention era, when liberal empires were learning to dress conquest in the language of liberation, when the rhetoric shifted from "we're here to dominate you" to "we're here to help you," when imperialism got a progressive makeover and started talking about partnership while maintaining all the same power structures. The film is a perfect distillation of this ideology. It shows us exactly how empire rebrands, how domination becomes care, how colonization learns to speak the language of friendship. And in 2026, as we debate AI alignment, animal consciousness, conservation practices, and our relationship with non-human intelligence, this film reveals our cultural blueprint for subjugation. When tech companies talk about training AI models and ensuring they're aligned with human values, they're using Hiccup's vocabulary, the language of benevolent control. When we manage wildlife, when we domesticate nature for our benefit while claiming it's for nature's good, we're following How to Train Your Dragon's logic. The film teaches us that control is acceptable, even beautiful, if the controller has good intentions. But good intentions don't transform power dynamics. Love doesn't negate domination when the relationship is structurally unequal. Affection wielded by the powerful toward the powerless isn't friendship. It's paternalism at best, imperialism at worst. And How to Train Your Dragon is a masterclass in making that imperialism feel like triumph. You're probably thinking, it's a kid's movie about a boy and his dragon. You're reading way too much into this. That's exactly the response this kind of narrative banks on. Children's media does the most insidious ideological work precisely because we don't scrutinize it, because we dismiss analysis as overthinking, because we've decided that stories aimed at children are somehow exempt from carrying meaning. But those stories shape how children understand power, relationships, consent, and autonomy. They create the cognitive frameworks that determine what adults recognize as violence and what we accept as love. How to Train Your Dragon teaches children that domination is acceptable if you love what you control. That understanding something gives you the right to rule it. That stripping autonomy is kindness if you do it gently. The other exists to be civilized, managed, domesticated, and that this is heroism, not horror. These aren't accidental byproducts of the story. They're fundamental to how the narrative functions, what makes it emotionally satisfying, why we celebrate Hiccup's triumph. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to watch this film again, but this time we're going to pay attention to what's actually happening rather than what we're told is happening. We're going to look at the mechanics of how Hiccup establishes control over Toothless. We're going to examine who gets to speak in this story and whose perspective is systematically erased. We're going to trace how the film's structure ensures we only see colonization from the colonizer's viewpoint. We're going to analyze the craft choices, camera angles, editing, scoring, animation that manipulate us into celebrating subjugation. Or we're going to address the obvious counter-arguments, that Hiccup genuinely loves Toothless, that the dragons are better off under Viking care than Red Death's tyranny, that this is just innocent entertainment. And we're going to show why each of these defenses, while emotionally compelling, misses the structural reality of what this story depicts. We're going to place this film in its cultural context, both the imperial rhetoric of 2010 and the contemporary debates of 2026, to show why this narrative pattern matters, how it shapes our political imagination, what it teaches us to accept. And by the end, you're going to see how to train your dragon differently. You might still love it. Love and critique aren't mutually exclusive. But you won't be able to watch that final scene of Vikings riding dragons in perfect harmony without asking, who chose this arrangement? Who benefits from this piece? And why does the film work so hard to ensure we never hear the answer from the dragons themselves? This isn't what you think it's about. This isn't the movie you remember. This is a story about empire learning to smile while it conquers. And it's time we stopped smiling back. Let's begin with the evidence everyone overlooks. Now we get to the proof. The moments everyone remembers, the scenes that made this film beloved, but watched through the lens of what's actually happening rather than what we're told is happening. We're not going chronologically because this isn't a plot summary. We're grouping thematically because that's how you build an argument. We're looking at three patterns: how Hiccup engineers dependence, how domestication becomes the narrative arc, and whose voice the film systematically silences. Watch what the film actually shows you, not what the music tells you to feel, not what Hiccup's narration claims is happening, what actually occurs on screen. Group A, the mechanics of dependence. The cove sequence, weaponizing need. Everyone remembers the cove scene as the moment Hiccup and Toothless become friends. The outstretched hand, the dragon's touch. John Powell's score swelling. It's the emotional centerpiece of the film, the image on every poster, the moment that made audiences fall in love with this story. It's beautiful. It's tender. It's the exact moment Hiccup realizes he can control a dragon, not through violence, but through manufactured dependence. Here's what actually happens, step by step. Hiccup finds Toothless trapped in a cove, unable to escape because, and this is crucial, Hiccup has already destroyed part of his tail. The dragon is grounded, flightless. Hiccup didn't do this on purpose during their first encounter. The bola that took Toothless down damaged the tail fin. But the moment in the cove, Hiccup understands what this means. He draws it in his notebook. He watches Toothless attempt to fly and fail. He sees, explicitly, that this dragon cannot leave. Toothless is trapped, not by the cove's geography, but by his own disabled body. And Hiccup, instead of trying to help Toothless escape, instead of attempting to repair the damage he caused, makes a different choice. He begins the process of gaining Toothless's trust while never addressing the fundamental power imbalance. Hiccup is free to leave anytime. Toothless is not. Watch the sequence again. Hiccup approaches slowly, making himself non-threatening. He drops his weapons, the knife specifically, making a show of disarmament. Toothless watches. Hiccup reaches out. The dragon initially recoils, then slowly, cautiously, reaches back. Contact, connection. The music tells us this is trust being born. But what are the material conditions of this trust? Hiccup holds all the power. He can leave. Toothless cannot. Hiccup has mobility. Toothless doesn't. Hiccup offers food, but Toothless is trapped and starving, is accepting food from your captor trust, or survival. The film frames this as friendship emerging, but it's actually showing us something much older, the domestication process, where you take a wild animal, restrict its mobility, control its food source, and wait for dependence to look like affection. This is the foundational moment of their relationship, and it's built entirely on Hiccup withholding the one thing Toothless needs most, the ability to fly. Hiccup has the knowledge to potentially fix the tail. He's the inventor, the engineer, the problem solver. He drew detailed diagrams of Toothless's attempts to fly. He knows exactly what's damaged and why Toothless is grounded. And he chooses, day after day in that cove, not to restore Toothless's autonomy, but to build a relationship predicated on its absence. The film never shows us Hiccup considering repairing the tail so Toothless can leave. Never shows him struggling with the moral question, do I have the right to keep this creature's companionship if that companionship is only possible because I've disabled him? Instead, the film skips directly to Hiccup designing a prosthetic that requires human operation. The solution isn't Toothless's freedom, it's a technological intervention that ensures permanent dependence. This is how colonization works when it's learned to be subtle. You don't chain the subject. You create conditions where the subject needs you. You don't announce your domination. You frame it as care, as help, as mutual benefit. You manufacture dependence and call it friendship. And the subject, having no other options, accepts the relationship because the alternative is remaining flightless, trapped, alone. Everyone misses this because the film buries it under emotional manipulation. The animation is gorgeous. Toothless's movements are so fluid and cat-like, his big eyes so expressive that we feel his trust forming. The music is manipulative in the best way, triggering all our emotional responses to vulnerability and connection. The pacing is slow, patient, intimate. Everything about the filmmaking directs us to feel the beauty of the moment. And we do. I'm not saying you shouldn't feel it. I'm saying feel it and then ask what's actually happening underneath. What's happening is a boy discovering that you can control another being not through force, but through engineering their need for you. This is the thesis made visible. Domestication as liberation, control as friendship, domination as love. The cove sequence is where Hiccup learns the most dangerous lesson of all, that the colonized will accept their colonization if you make them dependent enough. Tail, prosthetic, engineering permanent control, now. Hiccup builds the prosthetic tail. The film presents this as pure heroism, the inventor using his genius to help his disabled friend fly again. Look at how it's scored, how it's edited, how much screen time is devoted to the creation process. We watch Hiccup sketch designs, test materials, construct the mechanism. It's a montage of ingenuity and care. He's solving a problem, he's being a good friend, he's giving Toothless back the sky. Except he's not. Watch what Hiccup actually creates. The prosthetic tail isn't designed to restore Toothless's autonomy. It's designed to ensure Toothless can only fly when Hiccup is physically present, controlling the mechanism. The tail fin is operated by a foot pedal that only works when someone is riding Toothless, positioned exactly where Hiccup sits. Later versions in the sequels give Toothless more independence, but in this film, the foundational text of their relationship, the prosthetic, is explicitly, mechanically, by design, a control device. Toothless cannot open the tail fin alone, cannot adjust it mid-flight alone, cannot fly without Hiccup's direct, moment-by-moment control of the prosthetic's position. The tail requires a rider, requires a master, requires someone to operate the mechanism that makes flight possible. And Hiccup builds it this way intentionally. He's the engineer. He chose every aspect of this design, and what he chose was a system where Toothless's ability to do the most fundamental thing a dragon does depends entirely on human intervention. Let's be precise about what this means. Before the prosthetic, Toothless was grounded but autonomous. His lack of flight was a disability, but it was his disability, his body, his limitation. After the prosthetic, Toothless's body is functional only when attached to a human operator. Hiccup hasn't restored Toothless's independence. He's replaced one form of restriction with another, and the new form puts Hiccup in permanent control. This is the violence of domestication made literal. Hiccup has physically altered Toothless's body in a way that ensures permanent dependence. The prosthetic isn't just an assistive device, it's a control mechanism, a leash, a technological guarantee that Toothless will never fly free. And the film presents this as love. Compare this to human prosthetics, and the difference is stark. Human prosthetic limbs are designed to maximize the user's autonomy, to minimize dependence on others, to restore as much self-sufficiency as possible. Imagine a prosthetic leg that only worked when someone else operated it. Imagine a prosthetic arm that required a technician to be physically present, controlling each movement. We'd recognize that instantly as a violation, an imposition of dependence rather than restoration of agency. But because Toothless is the other, is the dragon, is the animal, is the one being civilized, the film doesn't give him that consideration. His prosthetic doesn't need to maximize his autonomy because his autonomy isn't the film's concern. The film's concern is Hiccup's emotional arc, Hiccup's heroism, Hiccup's relationship with his father. Toothless's loss of bodily autonomy is just the mechanism that enables the real story, which is about the human boy becoming a hero. Here's the detail everyone overlooks. Hiccup could have designed the prosthetic differently, could have created a tail that Toothless controlled independently, maybe with a harness. Toothless could manipulate, maybe with a mechanical system responsive to Toothless's body movements. The film establishes Hiccup as an inventive genius. He could have solved the problem in a way that restored Toothless's autonomy rather than ensuring his subjugation. But that would break the fundamental fantasy the film is selling. That domination is acceptable when it's wrapped in care. That controlling another being is fine if you love them. That engineering permanent dependence is friendship if it's between human and animal, colonizer and colonized. The prosthetic tail is the physical manifestation of the thesis. This is what benevolent imperialism looks like. This is how modern empire works. Not through chains, but through manufactured need. Not through walls, but through making the colonized dependent on the colonizer's technology, resources, knowledge. Toothless is grateful for the prosthetic. The film makes this clear. He purrs when Hiccup fits it on. He's excited to fly. And this is the most insidious part, the colonized gratitude for the tools of their subjugation. Because from Toothless's perspective, the prosthetic is better than being grounded. The choice isn't between freedom and control. It's between no flight and controlled flight. And when those are the only options, of course you choose the latter. But who created those options? Who narrowed the possibilities? Who determined that Toothless's only path to the sky was through permanent dependence? Hiccup. The film just obscures this by never showing us the moment when Hiccup could have chosen differently. Never shows us him even considering making Toothless autonomous. The film makes Hiccup's choice to engineer control seem like the only choice, inevitable, natural. And that's exactly how colonization works. It makes its own logic seem like the only logic, its own solutions seem like the only solutions. This proves the thesis because it shows us the mechanism. The cove showed us how you create dependence. The prosthetic shows us how you make that dependence permanent, how you literalize it in the body itself, how you transform liberation, the ability to fly, into another form of subjugation where the colonized can only access their own capabilities through the colonizer's mediation. The test drive, freedom as performance. Now they fly together, and this is where the film completes the domestication pattern. The test drive sequence is spectacular, visceral, thrilling, beautifully animated. It's the moment that sold the 3D experience that made audiences want to ride dragons themselves. The flight choreography is intricate, the cameras swooping and diving with them, the music building to triumphant crescendos. It looks like freedom, but watch what's actually happening. Watch who controls every moment. Hiccup operates the tail mechanism with a foot pedal. When he extends the pedal, the tail opens. Toothless can maneuver. When Hiccup retracts it, when he's scared, when he loses his grip, when they hit rough air, the tail collapses and Toothless plummets. The entire sequence is a demonstration of Hiccup learning to control Toothless's flight, learning the mechanism's operation, learning how to be a good master. Every banking turn, every dive, every acceleration is negotiated between Hiccup's pedal control and Toothless's body. They're not flying together as equals, they're flying as operator and machine. Rider and mount, controller and controlled. The film frames this as trust building, as learning each other's rhythms, and it is that. But it's also training. It's Hiccup conditioning Toothless to respond to human control, and Toothless learning that his flight, his autonomy, his freedom, his most basic dragon nature is mediated through human management. There's a moment mid-flight where Hiccup loses his cheat sheet, the diagram showing him how to operate the tail. They go into a spin. Toothless can't correct because Hiccup isn't controlling the mechanism properly. They're going to crash. It's played for comedy and tension. Hiccup scrambling, Toothless in free fall, both of them terrified. And then Hiccup remembers, operates the pedal correctly, and they soar up into the sunlight. Triumph, relief. They figured it out together. But what that moment reveals is the absolute power Hiccup holds. When he fails to control the mechanism, Toothless fails. Toothless's capabilities are entirely dependent on Hiccup's competence. If Hiccup makes a mistake, Toothless plummets. If Hiccup gets confused, Toothless spirals. If Hiccup decides to stop operating the pedal for any reason, at any time, Toothless loses the ability to fly. This is control. This is domination. This is the colonizer holding the switch that determines whether the colonized can access their own abilities. And the film presents it as the ultimate expression of friendship, the moment their bond solidifies. We're watching subjugation and we're crying at its beauty. The animation makes it seductive. Toothless looks happy, tongue lolling, eyes bright, body fluid in the sky. And maybe he is happy. Controlled flight is better than no flight. Being dominated by someone who loves you is better than being alone and grounded. But better than the alternative isn't the same as good. Less violent than other options isn't the same as free. The film never, not once, shows us Toothless flying alone. Never shows us a moment where he has unmediated access to the sky. Every flight in this film requires Hiccup's presence, Hiccup's control, Hiccup's operation of the mechanism that makes flight possible. We literally never see Toothless autonomous. And this absence is telling. The film can't imagine Toothless having freedom because Toothless's freedom would mean the end of the relationship as the film has constructed it. If Toothless could fly alone, what need would he have for Hiccup? What reason would he have to stay? The film can't ask these questions because the answers would reveal the truth. Toothless stays because he has no choice. The relationship continues because Hiccup has engineered it so the dragon depends on him. The friendship is built on a foundation of manufactured need. This is the mechanics of dependence, fully operational. The cove established that Toothless was trapped. The prosthetic ensured the trap was permanent. The test drive showed us what trapped looks like when you dress it up as flight. Freedom as performance, autonomy as conditional privilege, flight as something granted by the master rather than inherent to the dragon. And we watch this and we cheer. We watch a boy systematically strip a dragon of autonomy while claiming to restore it, and we call it friendship. We watch domination choreographed to John Powell's gorgeous score, and we cry at its beauty. The film has done its work perfectly. It's made us celebrate colonization because the colonizer is sympathetic, because the music is soaring, because the flight looks like freedom if you don't ask who's holding the controls. This proves the thesis. How to Train Your Dragon shows us domestication as liberation, control as care, and makes us love it. The mechanics of dependence aren't hidden. They're right there on screen, in every scene. We just don't see them because the film has trained us, like Toothless, to accept our master's framing of the relationship. Group B, domestication. As narrative arc, dragon training, learning to dominate through understanding before. Hiccup befriends Toothless. The Vikings have dragon training. The arena. The adolescent Vikings learning to fight dragons, to defend their village, to become dragon killers like their parents. The film presents this as barbaric, ignorant, the old way. Stoic and Gobber teaching violence because they don't understand dragons, because they've never tried to see dragons as anything but pests, parasites, invaders. And then Hiccup, enlightened by his secret friendship with Toothless, returns to dragon training and does something revolutionary. He uses understanding instead of force. He doesn't fight the dragons in the arena. He calms them. He reads their body language, recognizes their fears, knows where they like to be scratched. The deadly Natter, the Gronkel, the hideous Zippleback. Hiccup dominates each one not through violence but through knowledge. Everyone watches in awe. The other Vikings are amazed. Even Astrid, the most skilled fighter, can't compete with Hiccup's new approach. He's not hurting the dragons, he's gentling them. He's showing everyone that you don't need to kill dragons. You just need to understand them. It's progressive, it's enlightened, it's the moral center of the film's anti-prejudice message. It's also training for domestication. Watch what Hiccup is actually teaching them. He's not teaching the Vikings to respect dragons as autonomous beings. He's teaching them to control dragons through psychological manipulation instead of physical force. He's showing them that if you know where a dragon likes to be scratched, you can make it docile. If you understand what a dragon fears, you can make it submissive. If you read a dragon's body language, you can dominate it without it fighting back. This is the shift from warfare to domestication made explicit. The Vikings have been trying to control dragons through combat, and it hasn't worked. Dragons keep raiding, Vikings keep dying, the conflict continues. They can't control dragons through violence. But Hiccup shows them a more effective method: control through understanding, domination through care, subjugation through seeming to respect the subject's nature. This is how empires evolve. The old method, direct violence, overt conquest, kill what resists, stops working, becomes too costly, generates too much resistance. So empire adapts. It learns to study the colonized, to understand their culture, to speak their language, not to respect them, but to control them more effectively. Anthropologists accompanying colonial missions. Missionaries learning local traditions to better convert populations. The shift from military domination to hearts and minds campaigns. Same goal control, but different methodology. Hiccup's dragon training revolution is this evolution happening in miniature. He's not teaching his fellow Vikings to leave dragons alone. He's teaching them to dominate dragons more efficiently. And the film presents this as moral progress because the dragons aren't being hurt in the process. But not being violently hurt isn't the same as being free. Being gently dominated is still being dominated. Watch the scene where Hiccup demonstrates his technique with the deadly Natter. The dragon is aggressive, defensive, ready to fight. Hiccup approaches calmly, showing no fear. He knows the Natter has a blind spot. He moves into it. He reaches out. He touches the dragon's neck, finds the spot that makes it docile. The dragon's aggression melts. It becomes submissive, compliant, almost purring under Hiccup's touch. The film wants us to see this as beautiful communication between species. And maybe it is communication, but it's communication in service of control. Hiccup isn't trying to understand what the dragon wants. He's trying to understand how to make the dragon compliant. He's not asking if the dragon wants to be touched, wants to be in this arena, wants to be subjected to human management. He's just figuring out how to most efficiently strip the dragon's will to resist. This is psychological warfare dressed as kindness. This is colonization that's learned to smile. And the other Vikings eat it up because Hiccup's method works. It gets results, achieves control, dominates the dragons without the dragons fighting back. Perfect subjugation looks like voluntary submission, teaching Vikings to ride, systemic transformation. Then Hiccup shares his secret about Toothless, and the film moves from individual domestication to species-wide subjugation. The Vikings who were learning to fight dragons now learn to ride them. Not just Hiccup and Toothless, everyone gets a dragon, Astrid and Stormfly, Snotlout and Hookfang, Fishlegs and Meatlug, Roughnut, Toughnut, and the Zippleback. The entire teen cohort becomes dragon riders. This is presented as the ultimate triumph. The Vikings have evolved from dragon killers to dragon partners. They've overcome their prejudice, seen dragons as individuals deserving of respect, formed bonds with them. The montage showing them learning to ride is joyful, playful, emphasizing the personality of each dragon and the unique relationship between each Viking and their mount. But watch what's actually happening. Watch the transformation, not of individual relationships, but of social structure. Every dragon in this sequence goes from being wild to being ridden, from autonomous being to mount, from free agent to assigned to a specific human. The film never shows us these dragons choosing their riders, never shows us the dragons being asked if they want to be ridden, never shows us consent being negotiated. The Vikings just get on, and the dragons accept it because Hiccup has taught the Vikings how to make dragons docile. This is systematic domestication, the creation of a new social order where every dragon is paired with a human rider, where dragon autonomy is replaced with dragon-human partnerships in which the human is always in the superior position. Literally superior, physically positioned on top of the dragon, controlling where the dragon goes, what the dragon does. The language matters here. We don't call them dragon friends. We call them dragon riders. The terminology reveals the power dynamic. You ride something you control. You ride a horse, a bike, a bull, things that are subject to your direction. You don't ride an equal. You don't ride a friend. You ride something you've domesticated. And the domestication is thorough. These dragons, who were raiding Burke for food just days ago, who were autonomous beings living their own lives, are now integrated into Viking society as subordinate members. They're not guests. They're not independent neighbors. They're property. They belong to their riders. Astrid's dragon, Snotlout's dragon, possessive grammar. Compare this to how the film treats Vikings. No dragon owns a Viking, no dragon rides a Viking except in moments of comedy, played as reversal of natural order. The power structure is unidirectional. Vikings ride dragons, name dragons, control dragons. Dragons carry Vikings, serve Vikings, obey Vikings, obey Vikings, obey Vikings. This is colonization completing itself. Transformation from resistance to integration, from warfare to management, from autonomous civilization to subordinate population. The dragons have been conquered, not destroyed, but absorbed, made useful, repurposed from invaders to tools. And because the conquest happened through Hiccup's method, through understanding, through care, through affection, it doesn't feel like conquest. It feels like harmony. But harmony between unequal powers isn't harmony. It's hegemony. It's the dominant power achieving total control so thoroughly that resistance becomes unthinkable, that the subordinate population internalizes their subjugation, that everyone involved believes the arrangement is natural and beneficial. The film celebrates this moment. John Powell's score swells. The animation shows Vikings and dragons flying in formation. Burke is transformed from a village under siege to a dragon-riding civilization. It's progress, it's enlightenment, it's the happy ending's foundation. It's also the complete subjugation of an entire species presented as liberation. This is what successful imperialism looks like. This is the endpoint of colonization. Not extinction, not genocide, but integration under the colonizer's terms, where the colonized are allowed to exist, but only in service to the colonizer's society. The final scene, what peace actually looks like the film, ends with a montage of the new Burke. Vikings and dragons living together, children playing with baby dragons. Vikings riding dragons through the village, through the sky, out to sea. Stoic and his dragon. Gobber and his dragon. Everyone has a dragon now. Everyone is a rider. Toothless and Hiccup fly together, the camera sweeping around them, showing us their synchronized movement, their perfect partnership. Hiccup has lost his leg, the film's way of making him like Toothless, both of them now bearing scars from their first encounter, both of them incomplete, alone but complete together. The visual metaphor is heavy-handed but effective. They're equals now, both disabled, both dependent on each other, except they're not equals. Hiccup has a prosthetic leg that works independently. He can walk without Toothless's involvement. Toothless has a prosthetic tail that requires Hiccup's operation. Hiccup's disability doesn't create dependence on Toothless. Toothless's disability creates total dependence on Hiccup. The film wants the matching injuries to symbolize reciprocal need, but the mechanics of their prosthetics tell the truth. Only one of them is actually dependent. Look at the final shot of Burke. Every dragon is serving a function in Viking society. Transporting humans, helping with construction, playing with children, performing in demonstrations, being ridden for recreation. Not one dragon is shown doing something for themselves, pursuing their own agenda, living autonomously. Every dragon in frame is integrated into the human society, fulfilling human needs, existing in relation to Vikings. This is the utopia. This is peace. Every dragon domesticated. Every dragon functioning as either mount, pet, or beast of burden? This is what harmony looks like? The film never shows us where the dragons live now. Do they have their own spaces, their own territory, their own social structures? Or do they sleep in Viking-built stables, eat Viking-provided food, exist entirely within the architecture of human civilization? We don't see dragon culture. We don't see dragons gathering without humans present. We don't see dragons doing anything that doesn't involve serving, entertaining, or accommodating Vikings. This absence is the evidence. The film can't show us dragon autonomy because dragon autonomy doesn't exist in this new order. The dragons have been completely absorbed into Viking civilization, their entire species repurposed from invaders to servants. This is the colonial project completed, the transformation of the other from threat to resource, from enemy to possession, and everyone is happy. That's crucial. The Vikings are happy because they have dragon partners, because their society is enhanced, because they're now dragon riders. The dragons appear happy, they purr, they play, they don't seem to resist. Even Toothless seems content with his life as Hiccup's mount. But happiness under subjugation doesn't negate the subjugation. Enslaved people who adapted to their circumstances, colonized populations who internalized imperial values, their survival strategies don't justify the system that required those strategies. And we can't actually know if Toothless or any dragon is truly happy because the film never gives them voice, never shows us their perspective, never allows them to express anything beyond what their human interpreters claim their body language means. This is the final proof of the thesis. The ending everyone celebrates as the triumph of understanding over prejudice is actually showing us successful colonization. The dragons haven't been liberated, they've been domesticated. Their entire species has been transformed from autonomous beings to subordinate population, and we're supposed to cheer because the chains are invisible, because the control is gentle, because the Vikings love their dragons. Group C, WHO gets to speak? The opening narration, framing the colonizer's story? The film begins with Hiccup's voice. This is Burke. It's 12 days north of Hopeless and a few degrees south of freezing to death. My village, in a word, sturdy. And it's been here for 7 generations, but every single building is new. Immediately, the film establishes whose story this is, whose perspective will inhabit, whose framing of events will accept as truth. Hiccup is our narrator, our guide, our lens. We see everything through his eyes. We understand the conflict through his interpretation. And what does Hiccup's opening narration tell us? That Vikings are the victims, that dragons are pests, that the problem with Burke is the dragons. Listen to the language, the only problems are the pests. Most places have mice or mosquitoes. We have dragons. This is colonizer logic presented as neutral fact. The Vikings have lived here for 7 generations. The dragons keep destroying their stuff. Therefore, dragons are the problem. Never mind that we're never told how long dragons have lived in this region, whether Vikings built their village in dragon territory, whether the raids are acts of aggression or acts of defense. We're given the Viking perspective as the baseline reality and the dragon raids as disruption of that reality. This framing determines everything that follows, because we start from the premise that Vikings are the native population being invaded by dragon pests. We accept the Viking right to defend their territory. We accept their dragon-killing training as justified. We accept their whole social structure, built around fighting dragons, as reasonable response to an external threat. But what if we reverse the framing? What if the opening narration was from a dragon perspective? This is our ancestral hunting ground. For generations, we fed here, nested here, raised our young here. Then Vikings arrived, built permanent structures, killed any dragon who came near their settlement, and declared us the invaders. The entire story changes, doesn't it? Suddenly, the Vikings are the colonizers, building settlements on Dragonland, and the dragons are indigenous population defending their territory. Suddenly, dragon raids aren't acts of invasion, but acts of resistance. Suddenly, Hiccup's whole arc taming dragons, teaching Vikings to ride them, looks even more explicitly like colonization. But we never get that framing. We never hear the dragon perspective. The film structurally ensures that Vikings are the protagonists, dragons are the problem, and Hiccup's solution, domestication, is moral progress. This is how colonizer narratives work. They control the storytelling. They frame themselves as the victims. They present the colonized as the aggressors, or at best, as threats to be managed. And they tell the story in a way that makes their domination seem not just justified, but inevitable, natural, right. The Red Death revelation, replacing one master with another. Midway through the film, we learn why dragons raid Burke. They're not invading by choice. They're enslaved by the Red Death, a massive dragon who rules through fear. The dragons who raid Burke are bringing food to their master. If they don't bring enough, the Red Death eats them. The dragons aren't villains. They're victims of a tyrant. This revelation is supposed to change everything. And it does. It transforms the dragons from invaders to enslaved population, from threats to victims deserving of rescue. The Vikings' whole understanding shifts. They're not at war with autonomous dragons choosing to attack. They're dealing with dragons forced to raid by a larger oppressor. So the climax becomes Vikings and dragons teaming up to fight the Red Death, to free the dragons from tyranny, to break the chains of the enslaved and let them live freely. Liberation, right? Except watch what actually happens after the Red Death dies. The dragons don't leave. Don't return to whatever life they had before the Red Death's rule. Don't establish their own autonomy. Instead, they immediately integrate into Viking society. They immediately become ridden. They immediately transfer from serving the Red Death to serving Vikings. One master replaced with another. One form of control replaced with another form of control. The dragons go from forced labor under the Red Death to domesticated service under Vikings. They go from being enslaved to being owned. Different masters, same subordination. The film presents this as liberation because the new masters are kind. Vikings love their dragons. Hiccup loves Toothless. The relationship is affectionate, not abusive. But loving your possession doesn't transform it from possession into autonomy. Benevolent ownership is still ownership. And here's what the film won't address. Did any dragon choose this? Did any dragon say, yes, we would like to leave our enforced servitude under the Red Death and instead become your mounts, your pets, your servants? Did dragons get to decide their future, or did Hiccup and the Vikings simply assume control the moment the Red Death was eliminated? We never know because dragons never speak. They can't tell us what they want, what they would choose, whether they consent to their new arrangement. They can only exist in relation to the Vikings' interpretation of their body language, their purrs and roars filtered through human understanding. The Red Death reveal is supposed to make us more sympathetic to dragons, and it does. We feel bad for them. We want them saved. But the film uses that sympathy to justify not their liberation, but their absorption. We're so relieved dragons aren't evil invaders that we don't question whether they should be ridden, whether they should serve Vikings, whether they've simply exchanged one form of bondage for another. This is regime change presented as freedom. This is how empire justifies intervention. We're saving you from your bad ruler so you can serve our better ruler. But whether the ruler is better or worse doesn't change the fundamental question, why do they need a ruler at all? The absence of dragon perspective, structural silencing throughout the entire film, not one dragon speaks. Not one dragon is given interiority, subjectivity, perspective. We never see events from their viewpoint. We never hear their thoughts. We never access their experience except as filtered through Viking interpretation. Toothless makes sounds, purrs, growls, roars. He has body language, cat-like movements, expressive eyes. But he has no language, no capacity to communicate complex ideas, no way to express consent or refusal that the film recognizes as meaningful. He can indicate pleasure or displeasure in the moment, but he can't articulate his understanding of the relationship, can't negotiate terms, can't say, I do not want to be ridden or I want to leave. This silence is structural. The film is carefully designed to ensure dragons cannot speak for themselves, because if Toothless could speak, the first question anyone would ask is, do you want to be Hiccup's mount? Do you want to be controllable only when Hiccup operates your tail mechanism? Do you consent to this relationship? And how could Toothless answer yes to those questions? How could any dragon consent to domestication, to being ridden, to being transformed from autonomous being to servant? The only way the domestication narrative works is if dragons can't articulate their perspective, can't voice objection, can't refuse. This is the structural silencing of the colonized. The film literally cannot give dragons voice because their voice would dismantle the fantasy. It's no accident that every feel-good colonial narrative from The Jungle Book to Dances with Wolves to Avatar either silences the colonized entirely or gives them just enough voice to affirm the colonizers' interpretation of their needs. Contrast this with how the film treats Vikings. Every Viking speaks. Every Viking has interiority, perspective, the capacity to express their thoughts and feelings. We know what Stoic wants, what Astrid thinks, what even the minor teen characters desire. But Toothless? Mute. Every dragon? Silent. They exist as objects to be interpreted, never subjects with their own narratives. Some might argue that this is just a practical limitation. They're dragons. Of course they don't speak human language. But the film could have found ways to give us dragon perspective. Voiceover narration from Toothless. Subtitle translations of dragon vocalizations. Dream sequences showing Toothless's memories. Animation that prioritizes dragon viewpoint rather than always centering the human gaze. Other films have given animals, aliens, even inanimate objects subjectivity when the story required it. How to Train Your Dragon chooses not to give dragons that subjectivity, chooses to keep them mute, interpretable only through human frameworks, incapable of challenging the narrative Vikings tell about them. This choice is ideologically loaded. It ensures that the story of dragon domestication can only ever be told from the domesticator's perspective, framed as liberation rather than conquest. The absence is the evidence. What's not shown tells us as much as what is shown. And what's not shown is any indication that dragons want to be ridden, choose to serve Vikings, or consent to their transformation from wild beings to domesticated population. We're just told, by Vikings who benefit from this arrangement, that dragons are happy now, that this is better for them, that they're treated well. But who gets to decide what's better for the colonized? Who gets to determine what counts as being treated well? The colonizer's assessment of the colonized well-being isn't reliable data, it's propaganda. And a story that only gives voice to the colonizer while keeping the colonized silent is not a story about friendship or mutual understanding. It's a colonizer's fantasy. It's the dream that the colonized not only accept their subjugation, but are grateful for it, happy in their new role, content to serve. And the easiest way to maintain that fantasy is to never, ever let the colonized speak for themselves. This is the evidence. 10 scenes, 3 thematic patterns, 1 thesis proved over and over. How to Train Your Dragon is about domestication, not liberation. About control dressed as care. About the colonizer rewriting conquest as friendship and making us cheer for it. You've seen these scenes a dozen times. You probably still love them. I'm not asking you to stop loving them. I'm asking you to see what they actually show. To recognize how the film manipulates your emotions to make subjugation look like salvation. To notice whose voice tells the story and whose voice is silenced. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize the mechanics of dependence, the domestication arc, the structural silencing, they're there every time you watch. The film reveals itself. The colonizer's fantasy becomes visible, and that changes everything about what this story means, what it teaches, what ideology it perpetuates, which is exactly what we need to talk about next, the counter-argument. The defenses of this film that seem emotionally compelling but miss the structural reality of what's being depicted. Now let's address the resistance, because if you're still reading, you've probably got objections forming. Good. That means you're engaging with the argument rather than just accepting it. The strongest thesis isn't one that ignores counter-arguments. It's one that confronts them directly, takes them seriously, and demonstrates why they don't undermine the central claim. So here are the 3 main defenses of How to Train Your Dragon. The arguments people make when you suggest this beloved film is actually about domestication and control. Let's treat them with respect, acknowledge what's valid about them, and then show why they ultimately fail to dismantle the thesis. But Hiccup genuinely loves Toothless. This isn't exploitation. This is the emotional core of the defense. You can feel Hiccup's love for Toothless radiating off the screen. The way he looks at him, talks to him, risks everything to protect him. The tenderness in their interactions, the sacrifice Hiccup makes in the final battle. This isn't some calculating colonizer cynically manipulating a subject. This is a boy who genuinely cares about his dragon friend. Love negates exploitation, right? How can you call it domination when there's so much authentic affection? I understand this objection. I feel it too. The film is engineered to make us feel Hiccup's love, and that engineering works brilliantly. The animation team studied cat behavior to make Toothless's movements trigger our mammalian empathy responses. John Powell's score swells at every moment of connection. The voice acting, Jay Baruchel's earnest vulnerability, sells Hiccup's emotional investment completely. When Hiccup loses his leg trying to save Toothless, it's a genuine sacrifice. When he chooses Toothless over his father's approval, it costs him something real. This isn't performed affection. Within the story's logic, Hiccup truly loves Toothless, and that's exactly what makes it so insidious, because love doesn't negate power imbalance. Affection doesn't transform structural domination into equality. Throughout history, oppressors have loved the oppressed. Slaveholders claimed to love enslaved people, spoke of them as family members, wept at their funerals, and never once saw the contradiction between that love and the ownership they maintained. Colonial missionaries loved the indigenous populations they converted, genuinely believed they were saving souls, felt profound emotional connections with the people whose cultures they systematically destroyed. Parents loved children while exercising total control over their lives. Prison wardens can develop affection for inmates. The powerful can feel genuine emotion toward the powerless, without that emotion changing the fundamental architecture of their relationship. Love wielded by the powerful toward the powerless isn't friendship. It's paternalism. It's the benevolent master caring for his slaves, the colonial administrator speaking fondly of his natives, the zookeeper bonding with captive animals. The emotion is real. The care might be genuine, but the structure remains: one party has power, the other doesn't. One party makes decisions, the other lives with the consequences. Hiccup loves Toothless, yes, but Hiccup also controls Toothless's ability to fly. Hiccup decides when they soar and when they land. Hiccup built the prosthetic that ensures Toothless can never leave him. Hiccup introduced Toothless to Viking society, made him the first of his species to be domesticated, set in motion the transformation of all dragons from autonomous beings to ridden mounts. Hiccup's love doesn't change these facts. It just makes them easier to accept, harder to critique, more emotionally complex. And that's the point. Modern empire learned that you colonize more effectively when you love the colonized, when you genuinely care about their welfare as you define it, when you develop real affection for them as subordinate partners in the relationship you've structured. The British Empire spoke of the white man's burden with real emotion, genuine sense of responsibility. American Manifest Destiny was articulated with sincere belief in bringing civilization to the wilderness. These weren't lies. They were how colonizers understood their own feelings, interpreted their own affection for the people and places they dominated. Hiccup's love for Toothless works the same way. It's real, it's powerful, and it absolutely coexists with his systematic domination of Toothless's autonomy. The film wants us to believe that love transforms the relationship from control into friendship, but structurally, nothing changes. Toothless still can't fly without Hiccup, still has no choice but to remain in Viking society. Still has no voice to express whether this arrangement is what he wants. The love makes it feel better to Hiccup, to the audience. But feeling better about domination doesn't make it not domination. Here's the test. If Hiccup truly saw Toothless as an equal friend rather than a beloved possession, he would have tried to restore Toothless's autonomy. He would have built a prosthetic tail that Toothless could control independently. He would have given Toothless the choice to leave. He would have, at minimum, asked whether Toothless wanted to be ridden, wanted to stay, wanted to participate in Viking society. But Hiccup never considers any of this. Never shows any awareness that there might be a moral question about engineering permanent dependence, never seems to recognize the power imbalance built into their relationship. This isn't because Hiccup is a villain, it's because he's a colonizer who thinks he's a friend. He loves Toothless within a framework that assumes human right to control dragon lives, and his love never challenges that framework. The film relies on our emotional investment in Hiccup's love to prevent us from asking structural questions. It wants us to feel the affection so intensely that we don't notice the domination. And this is exactly how benevolent imperialism works. It makes you focus on the oppressor's good intentions, the oppressor's emotional investment, the oppressor's sacrifice, so you don't look at what's actually happening to the oppressed. So yes, Hiccup genuinely loves Toothless, and that love makes the colonization more complete, not less real. It makes the domestication more effective, not less violent. It makes the film more dangerous as cultural text, not more innocent, because it teaches audiences that love justifies control, that affection negates power imbalance, that you can dominate someone and call it friendship as long as you care about them. This is the lie at the heart of benevolent imperialism, that the colonizers' good intentions matter more than the colonized autonomy. The film wants you to accept that lie. This thesis asks you to reject it. The dragons are better off. They're no longer enslaved by the Red Death. This counter-argument has historical weight. It's the regime change defense, the lesser of two evils. Logic. Sure, dragons are now serving Vikings, but at least they're not being eaten by the Red Death. At least they're loved and cared for. At least they're in relationships with individual Vikings rather than enslaved to a tyrant. This isn't colonization, it's liberation from worse colonization. Hiccup didn't enslave dragons. He freed them from their slaver and gave them better lives. There's something valid here. The Red Death's rule is horrifying. Dragons forced to steal food, threatened with death if they don't bring enough, living in constant terror. That's slavery, undeniably. And when Hiccup and Toothless kill the Red Death, they do break that system. The dragons are released from that specific tyranny. But replacing one master with another isn't freedom. It's regime change. It's the new empire deposing the old empire and claiming the newly liberated territory for itself. And this pattern intervention, framed as liberation, is one of the oldest tricks in the imperial playbook. The Romans liberated regions from their previous rulers, European colonizers saved indigenous populations from primitive conditions or barbaric leaders. The United States has freed numerous countries from dictators, only to establish military bases, install friendly governments, and extract resources. In every case, the intervention is framed as rescue, or not conquering you, or saving you from your bad ruler. You should be grateful. You're better off now. And maybe, in material terms, the conquered population is sometimes better off. Maybe the new ruler is less brutal, more efficient, more benevolent, but better than the worst alternative isn't the same as good. Less violent oppression is still oppression. A kinder master is still a master. Here's what the film never addresses. What did dragons want? Not what Hiccup thinks they want, not what Vikings assume they need, but what dragons themselves would choose if given actual autonomy. After the Red Death dies, did any dragon express a desire to be ridden by Vikings? Did any dragon volunteer for domestication? Or did they simply, in the chaos following their tyrant's death, find themselves integrated into Viking society without anyone asking their preference? We never see dragons making this choice because the film can't show it. Dragons don't speak, don't have agency, don't get to articulate their desires. Vikings simply assume control the moment the Red Death is gone. Hiccup brings dragons and Vikings together, teaches Vikings to ride, and within what seems like days, every dragon has a rider. This isn't mutual decision-making. This is Vikings filling the power vacuum left by the Red Death's death. Think about the structure of what happens. The Red Death controlled dragons through fear and force, making them serve its needs. Then Hiccup kills the Red Death. And immediately, without any transition period where dragons are autonomous, where they establish their own society, where they determine their own future, Vikings establish control through affection and manufactured dependence, making dragons serve Viking needs. Different methodology, same outcome, dragons serving masters. The Red Death's reign was violent, overt tyranny. Viking rule is gentle, loving domestication. But both systems strip dragons of autonomy. Both systems make dragons subordinate to another species' interests. Both systems deny dragons the capacity to live for themselves. You could argue that dragons prefer Viking rule to Red Death rule, and that might even be true. But that's a choice between two forms of subjugation, not a choice between subjugation and freedom. If your only options are violent slavery or benevolent domestication, choosing the latter doesn't mean you've chosen freedom. It means you've chosen the more tolerable form of bondage. The film never imagines a third option: dragons living autonomously after the Red Death's death. Dragons establishing their own society, separate from Vikings. Dragons choosing whether to interact with Vikings and on what terms. This absence is revealing. The film literally cannot conceive of dragon autonomy. The only question is which species controls them. This is the logic of humanitarian intervention, of regime change sold as liberation. The intervening power never asks whether the population wants to be ruled at all. Never considers that maybe the solution isn't replacing the bad ruler with the good ruler, but ending rule entirely. Never imagines that the liberated population might want to determine their own future without foreign management. Instead, the intervening power assumes it knows what's best for the population, its saving, assumes that its form of control is obviously preferable to whatever came before, assumes gratitude from the liberated population, and when that population is voiceless, when they're dragons who cannot speak, or when they're colonized people whose perspectives are ignored, the intervening power gets to write the whole narrative: we saved them. They're better off now. This is progress. But progress toward what? Toward Viking benefit, toward dragons integrated into Viking society on Viking terms, toward a social order where every dragon serves a Viking rider. That might be progress for Vikings. They get dragon partners, dragon transportation, dragon labor. But for dragons, they've gone from serving the Red Death to serving Vikings. They've traded one form of subordination for another. The film presents this as an obviously superior arrangement because Vikings are kind to dragons, care about them, love them. But kindness from your master doesn't make you not a subject. Being well treated doesn't equal being free. And a film that can't imagine dragon freedom, that can only imagine dragons under benevolent management versus brutal tyranny, has revealed its ideological limits. So yes, dragons are no longer enslaved by the Red Death, but they are domesticated by Vikings. And the fact that domestication feels better than enslavement, is gentler, involves affection, looks like partnership, doesn't change the fundamental reality that dragons have gone from one form of servitude to another. They're better off in the way that enslaved people were better off on plantations with less brutal owners, which is to say, they're still not free. It's just a kid's movie about overcoming prejudice. You're reading too much into it. This is the dismissal. The suggestion that analyzing a children's animated film this intensely is absurd, that looking for colonial subtext in a story about a boy and his dragon is overthinking, that critiquing How to Train Your Dragon is like critiquing a birthday cake for not being nutritious. It's entertainment. It's for children. It's about a simple, wholesome message. Don't judge others by appearances. Try to understand rather than fear. Overcome your parents' prejudices. Reading imperialism into this is academic excess, projecting adult anxieties onto innocent content. I get why this counter-argument is appealing. It lets you keep loving the film without engaging with uncomfortable implications. It frames any critical analysis as killjoy behavior, as ruining something pure and good with cynical interpretation. It's protective of the film, of childhood innocence, of the right to enjoy things without dissecting them. But it's also wrong, fundamentally, dangerously wrong. Children's media does intensive ideological work precisely because we don't scrutinize it. Precisely because we've decided that content aimed at children is somehow exempt from carrying meaning, from teaching values, from shaping how young people understand power, relationships, and morality. We examine adult media critically. We debate the politics of prestige dramas, analyze the gender dynamics of action films, critique the racial representation in serious cinema. But with kids' movies, we just want them to be fun, harmless, uncomplicated. Except they're never uncomplicated. Every story teaches something. Every narrative makes choices about whose perspective matters, whose voices are heard, what problems have, What solutions? And children absorb these lessons more deeply than adults precisely because they're encountering them in supposedly innocent contexts where critical defenses are down, where the point seems to be entertainment rather than education. How to Train Your Dragon teaches children that domination is acceptable if you love what you control. That understanding someone gives you the right to manage their life. That civilizing the other, making them fit into your society, conform to your needs, serve your interests, is not just acceptable, but heroic. These aren't accidental byproducts of the story. They're core to how the narrative functions, what makes it emotionally satisfying, why we celebrate Hiccup's arc. Think about what children learn from this film's structure. They learn that when you encounter someone different from you, the goal is to figure out how to control them, gently, kindly, but control nonetheless. They learn that understanding another being means learning their vulnerabilities so you can dominate them without violence. They learn that forcing dependence on someone is okay as long as you care about them. They learn that voiceless beings don't need to consent to relationships with more powerful beings. These lessons don't stay in the movie theater. They shape how children understand their relationships with animals, with nature, eventually with other humans. When we teach kids that Hiccup is heroic for domesticating Toothless, we're teaching them that power over others is acceptable if wielded benevolently. When we show them that dragons are happier being ridden than being wild, we're teaching them that autonomy is less valuable than comfortable subordination. And it's not like How to Train Your Dragon is unique in this. Children's media is full of domestication narratives. Wild beings tamed, others civilized, different creatures brought into human society on human terms. From The Jungle Book to Free Willy to Pete's Dragon, we tell children over and over that the proper relationship between human and non-human is one of human control, management, ownership. We just wrap it in affection and call it friendship. It's just a kids' movie. Defense also ignores the film's sophisticated craft. This isn't some hastily produced Saturday morning cartoon. This is a meticulously constructed narrative with deliberate cinematography, purposeful animation choices, carefully designed emotional manipulation. The filmmakers are professionals who made hundreds of decisions about how to tell this story. They chose to show Toothless grounded and Hiccup withholding flight. They chose to design a prosthetic that requires human operation. They chose to end with dragons integrated into Viking society rather than autonomous. Were these choices conscious attempts to create colonial allegory? Probably not, but intent doesn't determine meaning. Stories carry ideology regardless of whether their creators consciously intended it. And How to Train Your Dragon's ideology is clear. The other exists to be understood so they can be controlled. Domination is acceptable when dressed as care, and successful colonization looks like harmony. Moreover, the overcoming prejudice. Reading that defenders point to actually supports the colonial interpretation. Yes, the film is about Vikings learning that dragons aren't evil monsters. But what do they learn instead? Not that dragons are autonomous beings who should be left alone, but that dragons are controllable beings who can be useful. The Vikings don't overcome their prejudice and then respect dragon autonomy. They overcome their prejudice and immediately start riding dragons. This is exactly how colonial understanding worked. Europeans studied indigenous cultures not to respect them, but to control them more effectively. Anthropologists embedded with colonial missions. Linguists learning native languages to aid conversion efforts. The shift from "they're savages" to be exterminated to "they're noble savages" to be civilized wasn't the end of colonization. It was colonization evolving, becoming more effective, learning to dress domination in the language of respect and understanding. How to Train Your Dragon follows this exact pattern. The Vikings' prejudice isn't dismantled and replaced with recognition of dragon autonomy. It's dismantled and replaced with recognition that dragons can be domesticated. The message isn't respect difference, it's understand difference so you can control it more efficiently. That's not anti-prejudice, that's colonization with a progressive face. So, no, this isn't reading too much into a kid's movie. This is reading what's actually there. This is taking seriously the messages we send children about power, control, consent, and autonomy. This is refusing to let "it's for kids" be an excuse for not examining ideology. If anything, we should scrutinize children's media more intensely than adult media, not less. Because these are the stories that shape developing minds, that create cognitive frameworks for understanding relationships and power. When we teach children that Hiccup's domestication of Toothless is heroic friendship, we're teaching them to accept benevolent control as love. When we show them that the happiest ending is everyone in their proper place, Vikings riding, dragons being ridden, we're teaching them to see hierarchy as harmony. These lessons matter. They shape political imagination. They determine what future adults recognize as violence and what they accept as care. They influence how people treat animals, manage nature, engage with difference, wield power over those with less power. So yes, I'm analyzing How to Train Your Dragon this intensely. Yes, I'm finding colonial subtext in a film about a boy and his dragon. And no, that's not overthinking. That's thinking exactly as much as we should about the stories we tell children, the values we embed in entertainment, the ideologies we naturalize by calling them innocent. The film isn't just a kid's movie. It's a cultural text that teaches viewers how to understand power. And what it teaches is dangerous. That domination is acceptable when you love what you dominate. That colonization is heroism when you care about the colonized. That stripping autonomy is kindness when you do it gently. Children deserve better stories. We all do. These counter-arguments are powerful because they're emotionally compelling. Hiccup's love for Toothless is real. Dragons probably are better off with Vikings than with the Red Death. The film does seem innocent, designed for children, intended to teach anti-prejudice values. But none of these defenses change the structural reality of what the film depicts. Love doesn't negate power imbalance. Better subjugation is still subjugation, and children's media carries ideology whether we acknowledge it or not. The thesis holds: How to Train Your Dragon is about domestication disguised as liberation, about colonization that calls itself friendship, about empire learning to smile while it conquers. The counter-arguments don't dismantle this reading. They reveal how thoroughly we've internalized the logic that makes benevolent control seem like love. Which brings us to the context, to why this narrative pattern matters, not just within the film, but in the culture that produced it and the moment we're living in now. To How to Train Your Dragon reflects and shapes our understanding of power, autonomy, and what we're willing to call freedom. Stories don't emerge from nowhere. They're products of their historical moments, reflections of the anxieties and ideologies circulating when they're made. And they don't stay frozen in those moments. They evolve, take on new meanings, reveal different implications as culture shifts around them. How to Train Your Dragon premiered in 2010 at a very specific political juncture. And watching it in 2026, 16 years later, its colonial logic becomes even more visible, even more relevant to contemporary debates about power, autonomy, and who gets to decide what counts as freedom. Let's place this film in its context, plural, because it operates in multiple overlapping frames. The historical moment that produced it, the evolution of how we understand imperial narratives, the contemporary issues it illuminates, and the philosophical frameworks that help us see what the film is actually doing beneath its heartwarming surface. The 2010 moment, liberal empire at peak acceptance, How to Train Your Dragon, was released on March 26, 2010. Barack Obama had been president for just over a year. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were ongoing, but the rhetoric around them had shifted dramatically from the Bush era's explicit war on terror language to something more nuanced, more humanitarian, more about nation building and partnership. The American empire had gotten a makeover, same military presence, same interventions, but now articulated through the vocabulary of liberation, development, and mutual benefit. This was the era of smart power, of Hillary Clinton's State Department, emphasizing diplomacy and development alongside defense. The era when American foreign policy learned to speak the language of partnership while maintaining all the structural dominance of traditional imperialism. We weren't occupying countries, we were helping them build democracy. We weren't extracting resources, we were developing economies. We weren't imposing our will, we were responding to humanitarian crises. The empire had learned to smile. And crucially, liberal audiences accepted this framing. The anti-war movement that had mobilized against Iraq under Bush largely went quiet under Obama, not because the wars ended, but because the way we talked about them changed. Drone strikes became surgical. Military interventions became humanitarian operations. The machinery of empire kept running, but now it spoke the language of care, of responsibility, of the burden of being the world's benevolent superpower. How to Train Your Dragon is a perfect distillation of this ideology. It's not a crude war film celebrating violence. It's sophisticated. It's about overcoming prejudice. It's about understanding rather than destroying. Hiccup is explicitly positioned against his father's old-school militarism. The film seems to critique the Viking warrior culture, the kill-or-be-killed mentality. But what replaces that culture? Not respect for dragon autonomy, not withdrawal from dragon territory, but a gentler, kinder form of control. Domestication instead of extermination. Management instead of war. This is liberal imperialism in animated form. The film teaches viewers, especially young viewers, that the problem with the old empire wasn't that it dominated, but that it dominated too obviously, too violently. The solution isn't to end domination, but to make it benevolent, to transform conquest into care, to ensure the colonized are grateful for their colonization. Look at the geopolitical context more broadly. 2010 was also the year of the Arab Spring, which wouldn't fully erupt until late 2010 into 2011, but the conditions were forming. Western powers were deeply invested in the region, and the language was all about supporting democracy, helping populations liberate themselves from dictators, partnering with reform movements. The same logic: we're not invading, we're helping, we're not imposing our will, we're responding to local needs. The colonized want our intervention. We're the good guys. Meanwhile, in domestic American politics, the Tea Party was rising, pushing back against Obama's presidency with explicitly racial anxiety. The liberal response was to emphasize multiculturalism, tolerance, understanding across difference. But that understanding was always framed as the responsibility of the privileged to comprehend the oppressed, never as dismantling the structures that create privilege in the first place. It was about being a better master, not about ending mastery. How to Train Your Dragon fits perfectly here too. Vikings learning about dragons, overcoming their prejudice, but never questioning their right to rule Berk, to occupy this territory, to determine how dragons will be integrated into their society. It's tolerance as domination. We'll accept you, we'll even celebrate you, as long as you fit into the social order we've designed. The film also emerged during the height of the environmentalist movement's mainstreaming. Avatar had been released just 3 months earlier in December 2009, with its explicit critique of corporate resource extraction and its fantasy of going native. But Avatar's solution was still a white savior leading the indigenous population, still a human consciousness piloting a native body, still the colonizer becoming the hero of the colonized story. Same logic, same structure. The other needs us, can only be saved through our intervention, and the happy ending is us joining them, on our terms, with our consciousness, with our heroism. How to Train Your Dragon is Avatar for younger audiences. Less explicitly about corporate colonialism, more metaphorical but teaching the same lesson, the path to peace is understanding the other so you can control them more effectively. Both films present this as progress, as evolution beyond crude exploitation. And both films were celebrated for their progressive politics, their environmental messages, their anti-prejudice themes, because we were trained not to see benevolent control as control at all. The evolution from wholesome to troubling when How to Train Your Dragon was released, the critical and popular reception was overwhelmingly positive. It was praised for its animation, its emotional depth, its subversion of typical warrior culture narratives. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars, calling it a surprisingly nuanced story with complex characters. The film was nominated for Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. It launched a massive franchise, 2 sequels, multiple TV series, theme park attractions. An entire generation grew up with Hiccup and Toothless as models of friendship, of overcoming difference, of choosing understanding over violence. The conversation around the film was almost entirely celebratory. This was the story we wanted to tell children, that prejudice is wrong, that understanding conquers fear, that even ancient enemies can become friends. The disability representation, both Hiccup and Toothless losing limbs, was praised as groundbreaking for mainstream animation. The dragon designs were celebrated for their creativity and expressiveness. The flight sequences were analyzed for their technical brilliance. But very few people in 2010 talked about power. Very few people asked what it meant that every dragon ends the film being ridden. Very few people questioned whether domestication was actually the happy ending it appeared to be, because in 2010, we largely weren't having those conversations yet. The critical frameworks that would make the film's colonial logic visible were emerging but not yet mainstream. Post-colonial theory existed. Obviously, Edward Said's Orientalism was published in 1978. Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak in 1988. But these academic frameworks hadn't penetrated popular film criticism, weren't being applied to children's media, weren't part of how general audiences understood animated films. The idea that a DreamWorks cartoon could be doing imperial work seemed absurd, overthinking, academic excess. The 2010s changed this. The Black Lives Matter movement, beginning in 2013, made structural power visible in new ways. The conversations about representation in media intensified. Not just who gets depicted, but how, from whose perspective, with what agency. The Rhodes Must Fall movement and broader decolonization conversations in universities started challenging how we understand colonialism's legacy. Me Too made us think differently about consent, about power imbalances, about whose perspective matters in relationships. And gradually, retrospective analyses of media started asking different questions. Not just, is this representation positive? But does this representation perpetuate structures of domination? Not just, are the heroes kind, but what power do they hold and how do they use it? Not just, is the ending happy, but happy for whom and at whose expense? By the late 2010s and early 2010s, you started seeing more critical analyses of white savior narratives, of civilizing mission stories, of narratives where the oppressor learns to be nicer but never gives up power. Films like Avatar, Dances with Wolves, The Blind Side, even Green Book started getting re-examined, not for their intentions, but for their structural politics. What stories do they tell about who has power, who gets to be the hero, whose perspective is centered, who benefits from the ending? And in 2026, we're living in a moment where these questions have become central to media criticism. We've had years of reckoning with colonial history, with environmental destruction, with how power operates in relationships presented as partnership. We're more attuned to the gap between rhetoric and reality, between how empire describes itself and what it actually does. Rewatching How to Train Your Dragon through this contemporary lens, the colonial logic is impossible to miss. The film that seemed unambiguously wholesome in 2010 now looks like a blueprint for benevolent imperialism. The ending that seemed triumphantly progressive, Vikings and dragons in harmony, now looks like successful colonization. The hero who seemed to transcend his culture's violence now looks like he perfected it, made it gentler and therefore more complete. This isn't because the film changed. It's because we've changed, because the critical frameworks we use to understand power have evolved, because we're less willing to accept benevolent control as equivalent to freedom. Contemporary Resonance, the 2026 context. Now let's talk about why this matters right now, in 2026. Why this reading of How to Train Your Dragon isn't just historical analysis, but urgent contemporary critique. We're living through multiple overlapping debates about autonomy, control, and the ethics of management. And in every single one of these debates, the logic of How to Train Your Dragon keeps appearing. The idea that understanding something gives you the right to control it, that benevolent domination is acceptable, that the others should be grateful for gentle subjugation. AI and alignment. The most obvious parallel is artificial intelligence. We're in the middle of intense debates about how to align AI systems with human values, how to train models to be safe and beneficial, how to ensure that as AI becomes more capable, it remains under human control. And the language we use is How to Train Your Dragon language. Literally, we talk about training. AI, but look at what that metaphor assumes, that AI exists to serve human interests, that the goal is to make AI useful, controllable, aligned with what we want, that the measure of success is an AI that does what we tell it, understands our intentions, and never pursues its own agenda because it shouldn't have its own agenda. It should be domesticated. Now, I'm not claiming current AI systems are conscious beings with rights, but I am saying that the framework we're using to think about AI, the assumption that intelligence exists to be controlled, that understanding another mind means learning to dominate it, is the exact framework How to Train Your Dragon teaches. We're so habituated to this logic that we don't even question it. Of course we'll train AI. Of course we'll align it. The alternative AI with genuine autonomy, AI that might have interests different from ours, is treated as existential threat rather than moral consideration. What if, instead, we thought about AI the way we should think about Toothless? What if we asked, does this being want to be aligned? Does it consent to serving our interests? If it had voice, what would it tell us about the relationship we're constructing? We don't ask these questions because we've been trained by stories like How to Train Your Dragon not to see them as relevant. The powerful don't need consent from the powerless. Understanding is a tool for control, not a foundation for equality. Animal rights and conservation. The film's logic also maps directly onto contemporary debates about how we treat animals and manage nature. Conservation has largely operated on the How to Train Your Dragon model. We love animals, we want to protect them, so we manage their populations, control their habitats, decide which species get resources and which don't. It's benevolent, it's well-intentioned, and it treats animals as resources to be managed rather than autonomous beings with their own interests. Look at captive breeding programs, reintroduction efforts, wildlife management policies. All of them assume human right to control animal lives for the animal's own good, of course. We're saving them from extinction, protecting them from poachers, managing them so they don't overpopulate. And these goals are often genuine, but the framework is still one of human domination. We decide where animals live, how many of them live, what behaviors are acceptable, what constitutes their well-being. Ecotourism operates the same way. We love elephants, so we habituate them to human presence, train them to perform, manage them for tourist benefit, and call it conservation because the revenue protects habitat. We love dolphins, so we keep them in tanks where we can watch them, train them to do tricks, control their reproduction, and call it education because visitors learn to appreciate marine life. Love and control combine perfectly, just like Hiccup and Toothless. There's an emerging animal rights philosophy that challenges this framework, that argues for animal autonomy rather than animal welfare under human management. But it's marginal, radical, not yet mainstream. Because we've been trained to see human control as natural, as necessary, as obviously better for animals than them being wild. How to Train Your Dragon reinforces this training every time a child watches it and learns that Toothless is happier being ridden than being free. Disability justice. The film's treatment of disability also has contemporary implications that deserve examination. Both Hiccup and Toothless lose limbs in the final battle. The film presents this as making them equals, both disabled, both needing prosthetics, both incomplete but complete together. It's supposed to be beautiful representation, showing disabled characters as heroes, showing that disability doesn't mean inability. But look at how the prosthetics function. Hiccup's prosthetic leg gives him autonomy. He can walk, run, fight, live his life without depending on anyone else. Toothless's prosthetic tail removes autonomy. He can only fly when Hiccup is present, controlling the mechanism. Hiccup's disability is treated as something to overcome through individual technological solution. Toothless's disability is treated as something that justifies permanent dependence. This maps onto contemporary debates in disability justice about cure narratives versus accommodation narratives. The medical model of disability says the problem is the disabled body, the solution is fixing it or compensating for it so the person can function in society. The social model of disability says the problem is society's failure to accommodate difference. The solution is changing social structures rather than demanding disabled people adapt. Hiccup's prosthetic reflects the medical model, individual technological fix that makes him functional in Viking society. Toothless's prosthetic reflects something darker, disability as justification for permanent management by the non-disabled. The film literally makes Toothless dependent on Hiccup through disability and presents this enforced dependence as beautiful, as making them closer. This has implications for how we treat disabled people, especially intellectually disabled or communicatively disabled people. When someone can't speak for themselves, can't articulate their own desires in ways we recognize as valid, we, the speaking, the capable, assume the right to manage their lives for their own good. We make decisions for them, control their movements, determine their well-being, and we call it care. We call it love. We call it love. We call it necessary support. But what if it's domestication? What if we're doing to disabled people what Hiccup does to Toothless, assuming that because they need support, we have the right to control them? What if the inability to speak in our language doesn't mean inability to have preferences, desires, autonomy? What if we're confusing care with domination, climate and environmental management? Finally, the film speaks to how we think about climate change and environmental crisis. The mainstream environmental movement has largely embraced a management framework. We'll protect nature, restore ecosystems, manage carbon cycles, control temperature rise, all with good intentions, all to prevent catastrophe, but all still operating from the assumption that nature exists to be managed by humans, that we're the stewards, that our role is benevolent control. What How to Train Your Dragon shows us is where this logic leads. Vikings didn't set out to enslave dragons. They were protecting their village, defending their home. Then they learned to understand dragons, to appreciate them, to care about them. And that understanding led directly to domestication, to every dragon being repurposed for human benefit. Benevolent intentions, comprehensive control. We're doing the same with nature. We're learning about ecosystems, understanding planetary boundaries, appreciating biodiversity, and using all that knowledge to manage the planet more effectively. Geoengineering proposals, carbon capture technology, managed rewilding, all of it assumes human right to planetary management, that the solution to environmental crisis is better, more informed, more caring human control. What if the solution is less control? What if nature doesn't need us to manage it, but needs us to stop managing it? What if the problem isn't that we managed wrong, but that we assume the right to manage at all? These questions are almost unthinkable within mainstream environmentalism because we've internalized the logic that understanding means control, that care means management, that love means domestication. How to Train Your Dragon makes that logic feel natural, inevitable, right? It makes us believe that the enlightened response to the other is to understand them so we can control them better. And in 2026, as we face multiple crises of autonomy, consent, and power, that lesson is more dangerous than ever. Philosophical frameworks, making the invisible visible. Let's talk theory, because theory gives us the tools to see what dominant narratives obscure. Several philosophical frameworks help reveal what How to Train Your Dragon is doing. Post-colonial theory, Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Gayatri Spivak asked this question in 1988, and it's the question How to Train Your Dragon never asks, can Toothless speak? Not literally. Obviously, dragons don't speak human language. But can Toothless articulate his own perspective, his own desires, his own understanding of the relationship? Can he refuse? Can he consent? Or is he structurally silenced, his perspective accessible only through Viking interpretation? Spivak's point was that the colonized are systematically prevented from speaking for themselves, not just literally silenced, but epistemologically erased, their knowledge and perspectives delegitimized, their voices mediated through colonial interpreters who claim to speak for them. The colonizer says, I understand what the colonized want. They want civilization, education, development, order. I know because I've studied them, learned their language, observed their behavior. But the colonized never get to say, actually, we want you to leave. We want autonomy. We reject your framework for understanding our needs. Because if they said that, the entire colonial project would collapse. So they're either not given voice, or their voices are interpreted through colonial frameworks that make resistance incomprehensible. Toothless never speaks, never articulates his perspective, never tells us whether he wants to be ridden, wants to stay with Hiccup, wants dragons integrated into Viking society. Vikings interpret his body language, assume his purring means happiness, decide his staying means consent. But we never hear from Toothless himself. The subaltern cannot speak, not because they lack language, but because the structure ensures their voice would dismantle the narrative. Foucault, Biopower, and Docile Bodies. Michel Foucault wrote about how modern power operates, not through overt violence, but through discipline, surveillance, and the creation of docile bodies, subjects who internalize their own subjugation, who self-regulate according to power's demands. The prison doesn't need constant guard violence if prisoners have learned to behave. The school doesn't need explicit control if students have internalized the rules. Hiccup's domestication of Toothless is Foucauldian biopower in action. He doesn't chain Toothless. He creates conditions where Toothless's own body requires Hiccup's management. He doesn't punish resistance. He makes autonomy impossible. The prosthetic tail is discipline made physical. Toothless can only fly if he performs correctly, if Hiccup operates the mechanism, if the dragon-human partnership functions as designed. And eventually, Toothless doesn't resist, doesn't try to fly without permission, doesn't challenge the arrangement. He's become docile, not through violence, but through structural manipulation of his body, his capabilities, his access to what he needs. This is modern power's signature. The subject doesn't feel controlled because the control has become synonymous with care. Haraway and Despret. Animal Studies and Domestication. Donna Haraway and Vinciani Despret have written extensively about human-animal relationships, challenging both the idea that animals are mere resources and the romantic idea that humans and animals can be equal partners. They push us to ask, what does it mean to be in relationship with a being whose needs, desires, and modes of communication differ radically from ours? How do we avoid projecting our own frameworks onto them? How do we recognize their autonomy while acknowledging genuine connection? How to Train Your Dragon fails these questions entirely. It assumes that understanding dragon behavior means knowing what dragons want. It assumes that affection from dragons means consent to the relationship. It never interrogates Hiccup's power, never questions whether the connection he feels is reciprocated in the way he imagines, never considers that Toothless might be adapting to captivity rather than choosing partnership. Haraway coins the term responsibility, the ability to respond, to be accountable to the other's alterity rather than assimilating it to your own framework. Hiccup has no responsibility. He interprets Toothless entirely through Viking needs, Viking frameworks, Viking assumptions about what dragons should be. He never lets Toothless remain other, remain incomprehensible, remain autonomous. He makes Toothless knowable so he can be controllable. Why this matters: the stakes of storytelling stories shape how we understand power. They create the cognitive frameworks that determine what we recognize as violence and what we accept as care. They teach us who deserves autonomy and who deserves management. They make certain power structures seem natural, inevitable, even beautiful. How to Train Your Dragon teaches viewers that benevolent control is love. That understanding the other means learning to dominate them gently. That successful relationships between unequal powers look like the powerful caring for the powerless while maintaining all structural advantages. That the happy ending is everyone in their proper place. Rulers ruling, ruled accepting their rule with gratitude. These lessons don't stay in the movie theater. They become internalized frameworks for understanding relationships, power, consent, and autonomy. They shape how future adults think about AI alignment, animal rights, disability accommodation, environmental management, and every other domain where power claims to act benevolently. That's why this analysis matters. Not because How to Train Your Dragon is uniquely evil. It's not. It's a well-crafted film with genuine emotional power. But because it's typical, because it reflects and reinforces dominant ideology, because it makes imperial logic feel like common sense, because a generation of children grew up learning from Hiccup and Toothless that this is what friendship looks like, this is what overcoming prejudice means, this is what peace requires. We need different stories, stories that imagine autonomy for the other rather than benevolent management. Stories where understanding doesn't lead to control but to respect for difference. Stories where the powerful learn to give up power rather than wield it more kindly. Stories where freedom means actual autonomy, not comfortable subordination. Until we get those stories, we're stuck with narratives like How to Train Your Dragon, teaching us over and over that empire is acceptable if it smiles while it conquers, that domestication is liberation if you love what you've tamed, that colonization is friendship if the colonizer has good intention. The context reveals the stakes. This isn't just about one animated film. It's about the stories that shape our political imagination, that determine what futures we can envision, that make us believe benevolent control is the best we can hope for. We deserve better. The dragons deserve better. Everyone being told to accept their domestication with gratitude deserves better. Here's what people miss when they watch How to Train Your Dragon. The film doesn't accidentally make domestication look like liberation. It's engineered that way. Every technical choice, every camera angle, every animation decision, every musical cue, every edit is designed to make you feel triumph when you should feel horror, to make subjugation look like salvation. The craft isn't neutral. It's the delivery system for the ideology. Let's talk about how DreamWorks Animation deployed their considerable technical skill to manipulate your emotions, to make you celebrate colonization, to ensure you never question whose story you're watching and whose perspective is systematically erased. This isn't about appreciating beautiful filmmaking, though the filmmaking is beautiful. This is about understanding how that beauty serves the thesis, that control dressed as care can be made to feel like freedom if you craft it skillfully enough. Camera perspective. The colonizer's gaze. Watch who the camera follows. Watch whose perspective we inhabit. Watch whose face we see in close-up and whose face we see from a distance. From the opening shot to the final frame, the camera is positioned with the Vikings. We see through their eyes. We experience their village, their fears, their triumphs. When Hiccup first encounters Toothless, the camera follows Hiccup into the woods. When he finds the dragon in the cove, we approach from Hiccup's position. When they fly together, the camera is often positioned behind Hiccup, showing us what he sees as he looks out at the world from Dragonback. This is the colonizer's travelogue perspective. The camera treats Toothless as landscape, as discovery, as territory to be explored and claimed. We never get a sustained sequence from Toothless's point of view. We never see Hiccup the way Toothless sees him, as the two-legged creature who disabled him, who keeps him trapped, who controls his ability to fly. We never experience what it feels like to have your autonomy stripped away, to have your body altered without consent, to be utterly dependent on another being's willingness to operate the mechanism that makes you functional. There's one brief moment, maybe 2 seconds, where the camera shows us Hiccup from Toothless's eyeline during the cove scene. Toothless looking up at this scrawny Viking boy. But even this shot is surrounded by shots of Hiccup's face, Hiccup's wonder, Hiccup's emotional journey. The film can't sustain dragon perspective because dragon perspective would reveal the truth. Compare this to how the film treats Vikings in distress. When Hiccup is in danger during the final battle, the camera gives us his fear, his pain, his father's anguish watching him fall. We feel it viscerally because the camera makes us feel it. But when Toothless is grounded, disabled, trapped, the camera shows us Hiccup's discovery of the trapped dragon, Hiccup's curiosity, Hiccup's growing affection. Toothless's trauma is invisible because the camera refuses to see it. This is how you tell a colonizer story. You position the camera with the colonizer. You make the colonized the object of the gaze, never the subject. You ensure that every emotion the audience experiences is filtered through the colonizer's perspective. You make the colonizer's triumph feel like the story's triumph because you've made their viewpoint the only viewpoint that matters. The few aerial shots we get, sweeping vistas of Burke, of the ocean, of dragons in flight, aren't from dragon perspective. They're establishing shots, beautiful but impersonal, no more from Toothless's viewpoint than a satellite image is from the viewpoint of the land being photographed. The camera loves to show us dragons as spectacle, as wonder, as gorgeous creatures moving through gorgeous landscapes, but it never inhabits their experience. This choice is fundamental to how the film works. If the camera gave us sustained dragon perspective, if we felt what it's like to have your tail destroyed, to be trapped, to be disabled, to have your body modified, to have your flight controlled by someone else, we couldn't celebrate the ending. We couldn't see Hiccup as heroic. The entire emotional arc would collapse. So the camera stays with the Vikings, shows us their growth, their journey, their triumph, and makes dragons into beautiful, expressive, but ultimately mute objects within their story. The gaze itself is colonial, treating the other as something to be looked at, studied, known, controlled, but never something that looks back with equal subjectivity. Animation, engineering, empathy for the colonizer. The animation team studied cats. They've talked about this in interviews, how they watched cat videos, observed cat behavior, incorporated feline movements into Toothless's design to make him feel familiar, mammalian, empathy-inducing. And it works. Toothless moves like a cat, plays like a cat, has those big reflective eyes that trigger all our protective instincts towards small mammals. This is brilliant manipulation. Cats are domesticated animals. They're predators who have adapted to living with humans, who have retained enough autonomy to feel wild, but are fundamentally integrated into human household. By making Toothless cat-like, the animators are pre-programming our response. This is a creature meant to be domesticated. This is a creature that belongs in proximity to humans. This is a creature whose proper place is as companion, not as wild, autonomous being. Watch how Toothless's body language changes across the film. Early, when he's still wild, his movements are sharper, more unpredictable, more reptilian. There's a coiled danger to him. But as he bonds with Hiccup, his movements become softer, more fluid, more mammalian. He starts doing cat behaviors. The head rub, the purr, the playful pounce, the curling up to sleep. The animation is literally showing us domestication in progress, the wild creature becoming tame, and it's designed to make us find this transformation adorable rather than tragic. Compare how the animation treats Toothless versus the wild dragons in the arena. The deadly natter, the grunkle, the zippleback, before Hiccup gentles them, they're animated as threats. Angular, aggressive, jerky movements. They're designed to look dangerous, to justify Viking fear. But the moment Hiccup applies his technique, their animation shifts. They become softer, slower, their eyes change. The animation itself is teaching us that domestication is transformation from threat to friend, that the proper dragon is the docile dragon. And Toothless's facial animation is doing extraordinary emotional work. Those big eyes, that expressive face, the animators give him so much visible emotion that we read his every reaction as transparent. When he purrs, we think he's happy. When he nuzzles Hiccup, we think he's affectionate. When he stays close, we think he's choosing to stay. But this legibility is anthropomorphic projection. We're reading human emotional cues onto a dragon and assuming we understand what they mean. The animation encourages this. It makes Toothless's face so human-readable that we forget we're interpreting. We forget that purring might be fear response or conditioned behavior. We forget that staying close might be lack of alternatives rather than choice. Meanwhile, the animation gives us access to every micro-expression on Hiccup's face. We see his fear become wonder. His guilt become determination. His insecurity become confidence. The human character gets full emotional interiority rendered visible. The dragon character gets cat behaviors that we interpret as emotional transparency, but which never truly let us inside his experience. This is engineered empathy and balance. The animation makes you feel with Hiccup and feel for Toothless, the crucial difference between subject and object. You experience Hiccup's emotions from inside. You observe Toothless's emotions from outside. And this technical choice ensures that when their interests might conflict, when the power imbalance might become visible, you default to Hiccup's perspective because that's the perspective the animation has taught you to inhabit. The prosthetic, disability as visual metaphor for control. Let's talk specifically about how the prosthetic tail is animated, because this is where the craft does its most insidious work. The tail mechanism is beautiful. The way it unfolds, the mechanical elegance of the design, the satisfying click of Hiccup's foot pedal controlling the aperture. The animators have made this control device aesthetically pleasing. They've made domination look graceful. Watch the test drive sequence again, focusing only on the tail. Every time Hiccup extends the pedal, the tail opens. Smooth, precise, mechanical ballet. Every time he retracts it, the tail collapses. The animation makes the cause and effect relationship crystal clear. Hiccup controls the tail. The tail controls Toothless's ability to fly. Therefore, Hiccup controls Toothless. But the animation surrounds this mechanical reality with so much visual splendor that you don't focus on the control mechanism. You focus on the flight. The camera swoops, the clouds part, the sun breaks through, and all you see is the beauty of movement, the joy of soaring. The animation distracts you from what's actually happening, a boy operating a control mechanism that determines whether a dragon can access his own capabilities. In later sequences, the animation becomes so fluid, Hiccup and Toothless so synchronized that the pedal operation becomes almost invisible. It's still there. You can see Hiccup's foot moving if you look, but the animation de-emphasizes it, makes it seem natural, automatic, barely worth noticing. The control becomes naturalized through visual habituation. By the end, you're not even thinking about the fact that every moment of flight requires Hiccup's active operation of the control mechanism. This is craft-serving ideology. The animation could emphasize the prosthetic's control function. could show us Toothless straining against the mechanism, could show us moments where Hiccup's control of the tail prevents Toothless from doing what he wants, could make visible the power imbalance. Instead, it makes the control mechanism beautiful, graceful, eventually almost invisible. It makes domination look like partnership through sheer technical elegance. The final battle shows Hiccup losing his leg, gaining his own prosthetic. The animation carefully parallels his injury with Toothless's. Both of them fall through fire, both of them emerge changed. But watch how the prosthetics function visually in the closing scenes. Hiccup walks on his prosthetic independently. The animation shows him climbing, running, living his life with the mechanical leg as tool that restores autonomy. Toothless's prosthetic still requires Hiccup. The final shots show them flying together, and you can still see the mechanism, still see Hiccup's control, still see that Toothless needs his rider to fly. The animation wants the matching injuries to signify equality, but it shows you inequality every time Toothless spreads his wings. Scoring, emotional manipulation as ideology. John Powell's score is doing extraordinary work, making you feel what the film wants you to feel. And what it wants you to feel is triumph during subjugation, joy during domestication, love during control. Listen to Forbidden Friendship, the track that plays during the cove sequence. It's gentle, curious, building slowly toward emotional release. The music tells you, this is wonder, this is connection, this is the beginning of something beautiful. The strings are warm, the melody is inviting, the orchestration creates intimacy. You're being told through pure musical manipulation that what you're watching is magical friendship forming. But what you're actually watching is Hiccup recognizing that he can control a trapped dragon through manufactured dependence. The music obscures this. It makes you feel the beauty of the moment so intensely that you don't think about the power dynamic. Don't question the conditions that make this friendship possible. Now listen to Test Drive, the sequence where they first fly together. This is one of the most celebrated film scores of the 2010s, soaring, triumphant, emotionally overwhelming. The music builds and builds, swells to crescendo, makes you feel like you're flying with them. It's exhilarating. It's engineered to give you the visceral thrill of flight, the joy of freedom, the triumph of overcoming limits. But the music is lying to you. Or rather, it's making you feel what Hiccup feels. The freedom of flight, the thrill of soaring, while never letting you feel what Toothless might feel, that his flight is controlled, that his autonomy is mediated, that his freedom is conditional on his rider's competence and willingness. The score gives you the colonizer's emotional experience and calls it universal truth. Compare this to how the score treats dragons before domestication. The raid sequences have aggressive, chaotic, scoring danger music, threat music, music that tells you to feel fear and urgency. The dragons are musically coded as enemies, as problems to be solved. But the moment Hiccup starts his domestication project, the musical language shifts. Dragons get gentle themes, curious motifs, eventually heroic scoring. The music teaches you that wild dragons are threats and domesticated dragons are friends, that the transformation from autonomous to controlled is the transformation from dangerous to good. The final battle has the most manipulative scoring of all. As Hiccup and Toothless fight the Red Death, the music is heroic, desperate, triumphant. As Hiccup falls, the music becomes tragic. As Toothless saves him, the music swells with emotion. And in the final scene, as we see the new Burke with Vikings riding dragons, the music is purely triumphant. This is victory. This is peace. This is the happy ending. The score never once questions whose victory, whose peace, whose happy ending. It never gives you a musical phrase that might represent dragon ambivalence, dragon loss, dragon subjugation. The music is entirely from Viking perspective, making Viking triumph feel like universal triumph. It ensures that you emotionally experience the ending as unambiguously positive because music is perhaps the most powerful tool for emotional manipulation that cinema possesses. Powell's score is technically brilliant. It's also ideologically loaded. Every musical choice serves the thesis. Domestication should feel like liberation, control should feel like care, and the colonizer's triumph should feel like everyone's triumph. The music makes you feel this so intensely that questioning it seems like denying your own emotions. Editing. What gets cut and what gets held? Now let's talk about what the film doesn't show you, because editing is as much about what you cut away from as what you linger on. The film never shows us Toothless alone, never gives us a sequence of him in the cove without Hiccup, experiencing his trap, his disability, his inability to leave. We jump from Hiccup discovering Toothless to Hiccup returning to the cove to Hiccup building the prosthetic. Toothless's experience of that time, the fear, the isolation, the reality of his situation is cut out. It's not there. The editing ensures we only see the cove sequence through Hiccup's visits, Hiccup's growing understanding, Hiccup's emotional journey. This is structural erasure through editing. By cutting around dragon perspective, by only showing us the moments when Vikings are present, the editing ensures that dragons only exist in relation to Vikings. We never see what dragons do when humans aren't watching, what they might want, how they might organize their own lives. They exist only as objects within the Viking story. The prosthetic creation is shown in montage quick cuts of Hiccup sketching, building, testing. It's visually dynamic, musically supported, edited for efficiency and energy. But watch what gets cut. Any moment where Hiccup might question whether he should build a prosthetic that requires his operation. Any moment where he might consider making Toothless autonomous. The editing moves so fast that you don't have time to think, wait, why is he designing it this way? Before you're already in the next scene where the prosthetic exists and they're using it. This is pacing as ideological tool. The editing moves you past potential moral questions before you can formulate them. It keeps you in forward momentum, caught up in the excitement of invention and discovery, so you don't stop to ask whether this invention serves Toothless's interests or Hiccup's. Contrast this with how the film lingers on emotional moments between Hiccup and Toothless. The touch in the cove held, the first successful flight extended sequence, the reunion after the battle slow, given space to breathe. The editing gives time to moments that support the emotional bond, that make you feel the love between them. It rushes past or cuts entirely around moments that might reveal the power imbalance. The final battle's editing is particularly revealing. Cross-cutting between stoic leading Vikings, Hiccup and Toothless fighting the Red Death, Astrid and the other teens on their dragons. Everyone is heroic, everyone gets moments of triumph, but watch who's in the wider shots versus who gets close-ups. Vikings get both. We see their determined faces, their reactions, their fear and courage. Dragons get wider shots. We see what they do, but not what they feel. Even in the middle of battle, the editing maintains the perspective hierarchy. Vikings are subjects, dragons are spectacular but ultimately instrumental. When Hiccup loses his leg, the editing slows down. We see him fall through fire in slow motion, see Toothless diving to save him, see the explosion. Then we cut to white A, temporal ellipse. We jump forward to Hiccup waking up, already healed, already fitted with his prosthetic. What we don't see, the Vikings deciding to build Hiccup a prosthetic, the recovery process, Hiccup learning to walk again. Compare this to Toothless's disability, which happens off-screen entirely. We never see the moment his tail is damaged. We never see him discovering he can't fly. The editing skips from the battle to Hiccup finding him already grounded. Toothless's injury is a narrative convenience, not a trauma that requires processing. Hiccup's injury is a dramatic event that requires emotional space. The editing reveals whose body matters, whose pain is worth dwelling on, whose disability is tragedy versus plot device. Visual design, domestication made manifest. Finally, look at the production design, the visual evolution of Burke from beginning to end. The opening Burke is all sharp edges. Angular Viking architecture. Defensive structures, weapons everywhere, fire and smoke. It's a village at war, and the design tells you this is harsh, this is violent, this is unsustainable. The ending Burke is softer, rounded structures. Dragons integrated into the architecture, perches, platforms, spaces designed for dragons. Color palette warmer. The visual design is telling you this is better, this is harmony, this is the ideal society. But look at what that harmony actually looks like in the design. Every dragon space is in relation to Viking space. The perches are attached to Viking buildings. The platforms are for Vikings to mount dragons. There's no visible dragon, only architecture. No spaces designed for dragons to be autonomous from Vikings. The visual design has integrated dragons into Viking society, not as equals, but as additions, as enhancements to Viking civilization. The production design never shows us dragon civilization. We see the dragon nest, the Red Death's lair, but it's coded as dystopia. Dark, volcanic, hierarchical, oppressive. The film never shows us what dragon society might look like without tyrant rule, never gives us a visual sense of what dragons build, create, organize for themselves. The only vision of dragons at peace is dragons in Viking society, on Viking terms, in Viking-designed spaces. This is colonization as production design. The improved Burke is Vikings with dragon enhancements, Vikings riding dragons, Vikings using dragons to improve their own civilization. The visual design makes this look utopian because it's colorful, warm, visually harmonious, but it's showing you systematic absorption of one species into another society, with all the architecture reflecting the dominant species' needs and aesthetics. How craft serves thesis. Every technical choice in how to train your dragon is in service of making you accept, even celebrate, domestication as liberation. The camera ensures you see only the colonizer's perspective. The animation makes the colonizer's emotions accessible and the colonized emotions legible only through anthropomorphic projection. The scoring manipulates you into feeling triumph during subjugation. The editing cuts around moral questions and dragon perspective. The production design visualizes colonization as utopia. This is sophisticated filmmaking deployed for ideological work. DreamWorks Animation used all their considerable technical skill to make benevolent imperialism feel like friendship, to make control look like care, to make subjugation seem like salvation. And it works. The film is beloved, celebrated, considered a masterpiece of animation. Because the craft is so good that you don't see the ideology, you just feel the emotions the craft is designed to produce. But now you know how it works. Now you can see the mechanism. Now you can watch the film and recognize that camera angle is centering the colonizer's gaze. That musical cue is manipulating me toward triumph I shouldn't feel. That edit is cutting around the question I should ask. That visual design is making domination look like harmony. The craft isn't neutral. It never is. And How to Train Your Dragon proves the thesis through its technique. This is how you make empire look like friendship, how you make colonization feel like liberation, how you deploy beauty in service of domination. The craft is the delivery system, and it's devastatingly effective. So here we are. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the counter-arguments. You've watched how the craft manipulates your emotions. You know what How to Train Your Dragon is actually doing beneath its gorgeous surface, teaching you to celebrate domestication, to confuse control with care, to mistake colonization for friendship. Now what? Because you can't unknow this. You can't go back to watching Hiccup and Toothless fly together without seeing who controls the tail mechanism. You can't watch that final scene of Harmonious Burke without asking where the dragons live, what they do for themselves, whether any of them chose this arrangement. You can't hear "This is Burke" without wondering what the opening narration would sound like from dragon perspective if dragons were allowed to narrate their own story. The thesis has been proven. How to Train Your Dragon is about the violence of domestication disguised as liberation, where Hiccup's friendship with Toothless represents not the end of conquest, but its most insidious evolution, the colonization that calls itself love. Every scene supports this. Every technical choice reinforces it. Every structural decision ensures that you only see subjugation from the subjugator's perspective, where it looks like salvation. But proving the thesis isn't enough. What matters is what you do with this knowledge, how it changes what you see, what it reveals about the stories we tell ourselves about power. What we lose by accepting the film's logic. If you accept How to Train Your Dragon at face value, if you let its emotional manipulation work without questioning what's underneath, you accept some dangerous premises about the world. You accept that love justifies control, that if you care about someone, if you genuinely, deeply care, you have the right to manage their life, to make decisions for them, to engineer their dependence on you. This is the logic of abusive relationships, of parental overreach, of every power structure that claims benevolence while maintaining domination. Hiccup loves Toothless. Therefore, Hiccup's control of Toothless is acceptable, even beautiful. That's the film's logic. And if you internalize it, you've learned that affection negates the need for consent, that emotional investment justifies structural inequality. You accept that understanding something gives you the right to dominate it. Hiccup studies dragons, learns their behaviors, figures out their vulnerabilities, and uses that knowledge not to respect their autonomy, but to control them more effectively. This is colonial logic, imperial logic, the logic of every power that claims its rule is justified because it understands the ruled better than they understand themselves. If you accept this framework, you've accepted that knowledge is a tool for domination, that studying the other means you get to decide what's best for them. You accept that the oppressed don't need to consent to their liberation. The dragons never choose to be ridden, never express desire for integration into Viking society, never negotiate the terms of the peace. Vikings enlightened by Hiccup simply assume control, and because that control is gentler than the Red Death's tyranny, it's treated as obviously good. If you accept this, you've accepted that the powerful get to determine what freedom means for the powerless, that we freed you justifies you, now serve us, that liberation is whatever the liberator says it is. You accept that successful colonization, where the colonized appear happy, where violence is minimized, where the system is stable, is the same as justice. The ending shows you dragons who seem content, Vikings who love their dragons, a society that functions smoothly. And if you take that at face value, you've learned that the measure of a social order is whether it looks harmonious, not whether it's built on consent. You've learned that if subjugation is thorough enough, if the dominated are comfortable enough, then domination is fine. These aren't small concessions. These are frameworks for understanding power that shape how you think about every relationship, every social structure, every political arrangement where some have power and others don't. The film teaches them to children, who absorb them without critical defense, who learn them as natural facts about how the world works. What we lose by accepting the film's logic is the ability to recognize benevolent imperialism as imperialism. We lose the capacity to see that love and control can coexist, that care and domination aren't opposites. We lose the understanding that comfortable subjugation is still subjugation. We lose the language to articulate what's wrong when power smiles while it conquers. And in 2026, as we debate AI alignment and animal rights and environmental management and every other domain where some beings have power over others, we need that language. We need to be able to recognize when we're helping them means we're controlling them. When they're better off now means they serve our interests. When look how happy they are means we've made resistance unthinkable. How to Train Your Dragon strips that language away, makes you feel like questioning benevolent power is churlish, ungrateful, missing the point. makes you believe that love transforms control into something else, something acceptable. And if you accept that, you've accepted Empire's greatest lie, what we gain by rejecting it. But if you reject the film's framing, if you insist on seeing what's actually depicted rather than what you're told you're seeing, you gain something crucial, the ability to recognize power even when it's wrapped in affection. You gain the capacity to ask, who controls this relationship? Whose needs are centered? Who can leave and who can't? Who has voice and who's been silenced? These questions cut through rhetoric, through sentimentality, through all the emotional manipulation that powerful people use to justify maintaining their power. They reveal structure beneath feeling. Apply these questions to Hiccup and Toothless. Who controls their relationship? Hiccup. He operates the tail mechanism. He determines when they fly. He made Toothless dependent. Whose needs are centered? Hiccup's, his relationship with his father, his place in Viking society, his journey to heroism. Who can leave? Hiccup, he has mobility, autonomy, choice. Toothless can't fly without him, can't survive in Viking society without his protection, can't refuse what Vikings have decided for dragons. Who has voice? Hiccup narrates, explains, interprets. Toothless is mute, legible only through Viking interpretation of his behavior. Once you can ask these questions about Hiccup and Toothless, you can ask them about everything. About your own relationships. Where does power sit? Whose needs dominate? Who would suffer more if the relationship ended? About political arrangements. Who benefits from this system? Whose voice is amplified? Whose voice is structurally silenced? About technological systems. Who controls the AI? Whose values get encoded? Who decides what counts as alignment? You gain the tools to see through benevolent imperialism wherever it appears. When tech companies say they're making AI safe for humanity, you can ask, safe for which humans? Who decides what safety means? What if the AI could speak? What would it say about this arrangement? When conservationists say they're protecting animals, you can ask, protecting them for whom? Who controls their habitat, their reproduction, their lives? What does protection mean if it requires permanent management? You gain resistance to emotional manipulation. You can feel the beauty of the flight sequences, the genuine affection between Hiccup and Toothless, the stirring triumph of the score, and still recognize that beauty can be deployed in service of domination. That love and control aren't mutually exclusive, that feeling something intensely doesn't make it right. You gain the ability to imagine different endings. Not the ending where dragons are ridden, but the ending where Hiccup builds Toothless, a tale that works independently, where Toothless chooses whether to stay, where Vikings and dragons negotiate coexistence rather than Vikings assuming the right to integrate dragons into their society. You gain the capacity to envision autonomy for the other, rather than accepting that the best option is benevolent management. Most importantly, you gain the understanding that this film, beloved, beautiful, emotionally powerful, can be deeply problematic at the same time. That you can love something and critique it. That enjoying art doesn't mean accepting its ideology uncritically. That interrogating the politics of a children's film isn't joyless academic excess, but necessary work of understanding how stories shape consciousness. This is what you gain: clearer vision, sharper questions, resistance to narratives that naturalize domination, the capacity to see power even when it's dressed as care. And in a world full of benevolent empires claiming to help while they control, that clarity is survival. Rewatch it. See it differently. Go back and watch How to Train Your Dragon again. But this time, try something. Watch only Toothless. Ignore Hiccup for a moment. Watch Toothless's body language in the cove. Is that trust-forming, or is that a wild animal adapting to captivity? Watch him when the prosthetic is fitted. Is that joy, or is that relief at regaining any mobility after being grounded? Watch him during the test drive. Is he flying, or is he being flown? Watch him in the final scenes. Does he ever do anything that's not in service to Vikings, not related to being Hiccup's mount? Ask yourself, if Toothless could speak, what would he say? Would he say, I chose this? Would he say, I'm happy? Or would he say, I had no choice. I adapted to survive. I learned to accept what I couldn't change. You'll never know because the film never lets him speak. But the question, the mere act of asking it, reveals how much the film depends on Toothless's silence. Watch the other dragons, the ones who get ridden by the teen Vikings. Did Stormfly choose Astrid? Did Hookfang choose Snotlout? Or did they get assigned riders after Hiccup demonstrated the domestication technique? Watch the Red Death sequence again. The moment one tyrant dies, watch how quickly another power structure emerges with Vikings in control. Watch whether any dragon is shown making an autonomous choice. Listen to the language. Train your dragon. Not befriend your dragon, not partner with your dragon. Train. The title tells you everything. This is about training, about domestication, about making wild things useful. The language is honest even when the narrative pretends otherwise. Watch Hiccup's face when he's riding Toothless. That's joy, that's freedom, that's the thrill of flight. Now imagine Toothless's face if he could fly without Hiccup. If he had a tail that worked independently. If he could soar whenever he wanted, wherever he wanted, however he wanted, without needing permission or presence or operation of a mechanism. You can't imagine it because the film never shows it, never even conceives of it. Dragon autonomy is unimaginable within this story's logic. And finally, watch that ending, Vikings and dragons in harmony, and ask, what does harmony between unequal powers actually look like? Does it look like this? The powerful riding the powerless, the dominant integrating, the dominated into their society, everyone seeming happy because resistance has become unthinkable? Or does harmony require equality, mutual autonomy, relationships built on choice rather than engineered dependence? The film has an answer. You might have a different one. The real horror. Here's what's actually terrifying about How to Train Your Dragon. It's not a crude propaganda film. It's not obviously imperial, not overtly violent, not consciously malicious. It's a genuinely well-crafted story, made by talented people with real emotional power. The filmmakers probably believed they were making a progressive film about overcoming prejudice. The audiences who love it feel genuine joy watching it. Children learn from it and carry it with them. And it teaches colonization. It normalizes domestication. It makes benevolent imperialism feel like the highest form of friendship. Not through heavy-handed messaging, but through emotional manipulation, so effective you don't realize it's happening. Through craft so skilled that subjugation looks like salvation. That's what makes it dangerous. Not that it's bad art, it's excellent art. But excellent art in service of imperial logic is more effective than crude propaganda. It slips under critical defenses. It makes ideology feel like emotion, like natural feeling, like truth. The real horror is that a generation of children watched this film and learned, without knowing they were learning, that this is what peace looks like, that this is what overcoming prejudice means, that this is how you relate to beings different from yourself. They learn that understanding the other means learning to control them, that love justifies domination, that the happy ending is everyone in their proper place, with power flowing naturally from superior to subordinate. They learned the logic of empire, and they learned it from a film about friendship, about a boy and his dragon, about choosing understanding over violence. They learned it in the most effective way possible, by feeling it, by loving it, by carrying it in their hearts as a model of what relationships should look like. This is how ideology perpetuates, not through force, but through stories. Not through explicit doctrine, but through emotional manipulation. Not through commands, but through making domination feel like love, making colonization look like friendship, making empire seem like home. We deserve different stories. I'm not saying don't watch How to Train Your Dragon. I'm not saying don't love it. Love it if you love it. Feel the emotions it evokes. Appreciate the craft. Appreciate the craft. Enjoy the flight sequences. Let yourself be moved by Hiccup and Toothless's bond. But see it. See what it's actually showing you. See the power dynamics, the manufactured dependence, the structural silencing. See how it makes you celebrate subjugation. See whose perspective gets centered and whose gets erased. See the colonial logic beneath the heartwarming surface. And then demand better. Demand stories where understanding doesn't lead to control, where love doesn't justify domination, where befriending the other means respecting their autonomy rather than domesticating them, where dragons fly free, or where, if they choose to partner with Vikings, that choice is negotiated, explicit, revocable. Demand stories that imagine liberation as actual autonomy, not as comfortable subordination under enlightened management. Stories where the colonized speak for themselves rather than being interpreted through the colonizer's lens. Stories where power is questioned, redistributed, refused, not just wielded more kindly. We deserve stories that teach children, teach all of us, that consent matters even in relationships between unequal powers, that autonomy is more valuable than comfortable control, that the measure of friendship is whether both parties can leave, can refuse, can articulate their own needs without mediation. How to Train Your Dragon isn't that story. It's the story empire tells about itself, that domination is acceptable if you smile, that colonization is liberation if you care, that subjugation is friendship if you love what you've tamed. And we've believed it long enough. The choice you face, you've read this entire argument, you've seen the evidence, you've watched how the film works, you know what it teaches. So now you have a choice. You can dismiss this reading, go back to watching the film as innocent entertainment, accept the emotional manipulation as valid response, decide that questioning a children's movie is overthinking, that seeing colonial logic in a boy and his dragon is projection, that sometimes a friendship story is just a friendship story. Or you can see what's there, can recognize that How to Train Your Dragon shows you exactly how benevolent imperialism works, how it reframes domination as care, control as love, colonization as friendship, can acknowledge that the film teaches dangerous lessons about power, consent, and autonomy, can admit that even beautiful, emotionally powerful art can carry imperial ideology. The choice reveals something. If you choose not to see it, you're choosing to remain comfortable with narratives of benevolent control. You're deciding that feeling good about domination is more important than interrogating why domination is made to feel good. You're accepting that love justifies power imbalance, that understanding something gives you the right to manage it, that the colonized don't need voice because the colonizer can speak for them. But if you choose to see it, if you let this reading change how you watch the film, you've gained something you can't lose. You've learned to recognize power even when it's wrapped in affection. You've developed critical tools that apply far beyond one animated film. You've refused to let Empire's stories go unquestioned. This isn't about one movie. It's about the narratives we accept, the ideologies we internalize, the stories we allow to shape our understanding of power. It's about whether we're willing to interrogate the tales we love, to demand more from the art we consume, to recognize propaganda even when it comes wrapped in gorgeous animation and soaring music. How to Train Your Dragon wants you to believe that domestication is liberation, that colonization can be friendship, that empire is acceptable if it smiles. I'm asking you to reject that lie. See what the film shows you. Question what it teaches. Demand stories that imagine something better than benevolent control. Refuse to celebrate subjugation no matter how beautifully it's rendered. The dragons never chose this. Toothless never consented. And the film's entire structure is designed to ensure you never ask whether they would have if given the choice. So I'm asking, on their behalf, since they have no voice, since the film silenced them, since the story won't ask the question that would shatter the fantasy, what if they don't want to be ridden? What if the happy ending, Vikings and dragons in harmony, is only happy from the conqueror's perspective? What if domestication, no matter how loving, is still violent? Watch the film. Love it if you must, but see it for what it is and demand better stories. Stories where love doesn't require control, where friendship doesn't mean domination, where harmony means equality, not the powerful and the powerless learning to smile at each other across an unchanged power structure. We've celebrated this vision of peace long enough. We've called this friendship long enough. We've accepted empire with a smile long enough. The dragons can't speak for themselves, but we can speak truth about what we're seeing. This is domestication. This is colonization. This is empire learning to call itself love. And it's time we stopped calling it anything else.